Before we dive in, take a deep breath and maybe hold it, because what you're about to hear smells suspiciously like history that hasn't washed in a few centuries. Picture mud, sweat, laughter, and the occasional flying cabbage. If you think the past was elegant, prepare to have your powdered wig knocked clean off. Now grab your seat, preferably one without fleas, and let's step into the wild, glorious mess of the Elizabethan theater, where the drama wasn't just on stage, it was everywhere. The air was thick long before the first line of Shakespeare ever echoed through the crowd. It wasn't poetry that greeted you when you entered a theater in Elizabethan London. It was the stench, a dense, living smell that clung to your nostrils and followed you like an unwanted lover. Imagine sweat that had fermented under heavy wool, the sour breath of cheap ale, and something far worse, the unmistakable scent of hundreds of bodies pressed together, leaking life in every possible way. Before the actors even spoke, the play had already begun, and its first act was the smell of humanity itself. The theater was democracy at its most pungent. Rich and poor crammed together in a chaotic celebration of culture and filth. The groundlings, those who paid a penny to stand in the open pit, had no roof over their heads, no chairs beneath their feet, and often no shoes. They stood in the mud, sometimes the result of spilled beer, sometimes of less mentionable fluids. And when nature called, there was no intermission. People relieved themselves where they stood, politely turning away if they were feeling civilized, or not at all if the play had reached a particularly exciting moment. It was performance art in the truest sense, a merging of body and stage, of laughter and leakage. The scent wasn't just an inconvenience, it was part of the experience. Actors were forced to perform above a sea of humanity that steamed like a cauldron. The smell of hundreds of sweating bodies rose through the wooden planks of the stage, wrapping around their legs and seeping into their costumes. And yet they went on, delivering soliloquies about fate and virtue while pretending not to gag. It gives theater under pressure an entirely new meaning. But the smell wasn't merely about the people, it was about the city itself. London was a place where garbage ran in the streets and animals roamed freely, leaving behind reminders of their passage. Theaters were built near rivers and open sewers, the cheaper districts that the nobles preferred to ignore. So when people say the atmosphere of a Shakespearean play was immersive, they aren't wrong. It was immersive in every sense, especially for the nose. It's strange, isn't it? We modern humans like to romanticize the past. Candlelight, sonnets, and velvet gowns. But if we could time travel back to 1600 and step inside the Globe Theatre, we wouldn't be met by grace or elegance. We'd be assaulted. The sweet scent of perfume from the upper galleries couldn't overpower the raw odor of humanity below. Maybe that's the hidden truth about culture back then. Art wasn't separate from life's filth, it was marinated in it. And yet, people loved it. They shouted, cheered, drank, and laughed as if nothing else mattered. The theatre was one of the few places where rich and poor breathed the same foul air. For a few hours, a lord and a butcher's apprentice could be equals in laughter and disgust. It's almost poetic. Filth as the great social equalizer. Imagine a nobleman trying to enjoy a tragic monologue while a drunk peasant beside him belched and scratched. And yet, both were captivated by the same words. The shared discomfort, the stench, the chaos. It bound them together in an oddly human way. Sometimes the crowd itself became the play. Actors had to compete with the noises of the audience. Not just talking or shouting, but coughing, sneezing, and yes, the occasional flatulence that could silence a verse faster than any critic. One can almost picture an actor pausing mid-line, staring into the pit and thinking, to be or not to be, drowned in this smell. It's easy to laugh at it now, but there's something humbling hidden in all that dirt. The people came because they craved stories. They wanted to see their own messy, imperfect lives reflected back at them. Not sanitized, not perfumed. Maybe the reason Shakespeare's words endure isn't just because they're beautiful, but because they were born in filth. His characters reeked of real life. They lusted, sweated, betrayed, and laughed like the crowd below the stage. Art was not elevated above humanity. It was elbow deep in it. And that smell, that unforgettable mixture of life and decay, wasn't just around the audience. It followed the actors home. Their costumes were rarely washed. Fabrics absorbed the odor of each performance until it became a permanent scent. Stage makeup, made from animal fat, melted under the heat and mingled with the sweat on their faces. By the end of the night, the performers smelled as tragic as their lines, and yet audiences adored them. They were celebrities of the gutter, adored, mocked, desired, and pitied all at once. There's a kind of honesty in that world that's missing today. Modern theaters are temples of silence and cleanliness, where people whisper if their candy wrapper crinkles too loudly. But back then, theater was alive. It breathed, coughed, and stank like the people who filled it. You didn't just watch a story, you survived it. Maybe that's why those plays had such power. When tragedy struck on stage, the audience didn't have to imagine suffering. They lived surrounded by it. And here's the curious part. Despite all the filth, the smell, the noise, people kept coming. Every week, thousands crowded those wooden arenas, paying what little they had just to stand shoulder to shoulder with strangers and lose themselves in words. Maybe that's the truest testament to art, that even when the air itself was unbreathable, people still needed stories, because stories were cleaner than reality. The next time someone tells you they wish they could visit the age of Shakespeare, remind them that nostalgia has no nose. The beauty of that era wasn't in the perfume of roses, but in the courage to find poetry amid the stink. It was a theater not just of words, but of humanity, raw, unfiltered, and gloriously alive. And as the crowd roared, laughed, and relieved themselves mid-scene, the actors carried on, pretending not to notice, pretending not to breathe too deeply, because the show, in every sense, had to go on. If you had wandered into a London theater around 1600, you might have noticed that not everyone was there for the art. The plays were an excuse, a background hum to something far more primal. Among the shouts, laughter, and the clinking of tankards, women drifted through the crowd. Painted faces, loosened bodices, and eyes that studied men the way merchants studied coins. They weren't there for Hamlet's melancholy. They were there for business. The theater, it turned out, was not only a place for drama, but for transaction, moral, physical, and occasionally criminal. Prostitutes walked between spectators with the same confidence as the actors who strode across the stage. They whispered propositions during monologues, led men by the hand through the maze of bodies, and disappeared beneath the wooden stands. In those dark corners, behind the echo of applause, other performances unfolded, brief, profitable, and utterly unscripted. Ironically, some of the best audience engagement happened off stage. The actors might have been reciting sonnets, but the true improvisation was happening in the shadows, where passion and plague made their nightly pact. It's hard not to laugh at the hypocrisy of it. The same men who booed at bawdy jokes on stage were often the ones fumbling for their coin purses moments later. Morality was a flexible concept in the Elizabethan theater, bending easily under the weight of desire and ale. The line between performance and reality blurred until no one could tell where the play ended and life began. In a sense, everyone was performing. The actors, the prostitutes, even the audience. London's theater wasn't just a building. It was a mirror reflecting a society that couldn't decide whether it wanted to be holy or human. And perhaps that's what made it irresistible. In a world ruled by hierarchy, where nobles feasted on privilege and the poor starved on scraps, the theater was the one place where everyone could mingle. Money bought you better seats, yes, but the chaos was democratic. A nobleman might find his expensive boots brushed by a drunk's elbow, or his wife's fan brushed by a working girl's smile. The boundaries dissolved under the noise, and for a few hours, sin and virtue sat side by side, sharing the same rotten air. It was equality in its most aromatic form. Of course, where there was crowd, there was contagion. The same closeness that made the atmosphere electric also made it deadly. The bubonic plague was the city's silent actor, waiting in the wings, carried by rats and passed through the air that everyone breathed. One infected sneeze could shut down a theater for months. Imagine the drama. A standing ovation one day, a mass burial the next. Yet people still came, as if drawn to the danger, as if art was worth dying for. Or maybe they simply preferred a good death to a dull life. When the government finally closed the theaters to stop the spread, it wasn't morality that motivated them, but fear. The same walls that echoed with laughter had become breeding grounds for death. The actors found themselves jobless, the stages silent, the city eerily still. Shakespeare himself fled to the countryside, his words quarantined like infected goods, and when the playhouses reopened, the audience returned. Thinner, perhaps, but hungrier. Death had brushed past them, and now life felt even more urgent. The truth is, the Elizabethan theater was less about performance and more about survival. People didn't go to escape reality, they went to confront it. They faced filth, disease, temptation, and chaos head-on, and somehow found beauty within it. It's a strange kind of courage, the courage to laugh while standing ankle-deep in mud and mortality. Maybe that's what made those plays endure. They weren't fantasies. They were reflections of a world where joy and decay danced in the same rhythm. And yet, amid the filth and the fever, there was a kind of poetry. A prostitute slipping a man a note during a love scene wasn't just a disruption. It was life intruding on art, reminding everyone that human desire doesn't wait for the curtain to fall. When the crowd roared, it wasn't just for the actors. It was for themselves, for the absurdity of being alive in a city that smelled of death and theater grease. There's something almost modern in that chaos. Today, audiences sit in silence, afraid to cough during a performance. Back then, they threw fruit, shouted advice, or declared love mid-scene. It was messy, but it was honest. They didn't pretend to be refined. They were gloriously unfiltered. Perhaps that's why those old plays still hit a nerve, because beneath their poetic words lies the memory of a time when people weren't ashamed of being human. They stank, they sinned, they loved, and they watched stories that mirrored all of it. Sometimes I wonder what Shakespeare would think if he walked into one of our theaters today. He'd probably be horrified by the silence, The audience's perfect posture, their polite applause, their bottled water instead of ale. He might even miss the chaos, the noise, the unpredictable energy of people too alive to sit still. Maybe he'd lean over to an usher and whisper, "It smells too clean to be real." Because that's the truth of it. The filth, the noise, the lust, and the laughter, they weren't distractions from the art. They were the art. Life itself was the performance, and everyone, willingly or not, played a part. And in that dizzying, dirty, dangerous crowd, the heart of theater beat louder than ever. Because the closer you stood to the edge of death, the more beautiful the story became. The plague wasn't the only thing spreading through the crowd. Ideas, rumors, laughter, and lice shared the same eager enthusiasm. People came to the theater for Shakespeare, but they stayed for everything else. The gossip, the chaos, and the strange satisfaction of being part of something gloriously indecent. There was no disinfectant for what you'd catch there, no safe distance from the raw pulse of the city. You didn't just see a play, you marinated in it. The smell, the touch, the noise, all of it fused into one long living performance that London couldn't stop attending even if it tried. There's a reason theater critics didn't exist back then. No one could write while dodging thrown apple cores. The audience wasn't an audience at all, it was a swarm. They shouted advice to the heroes, heckled the villains, and occasionally hit both with whatever food they hadn't eaten yet. If an actor forgot his lines, the crowd reminded him. If a joke fell flat, they booed until someone improvised something dirtier. It wasn't rude, it was participation. Today we call it audience engagement. Back then it was survival instinct. Actors learned quickly that to stand on stage meant more than delivering lines. It meant performing while someone tried to sell pickled eggs beside you, while a drunk man tried to climb onto the stage, or while two spectators decided to settle an argument with fists. The Globe Theatre wasn't so much a stage as a battleground where wit, sweat, and rotten vegetables collided. And yet, out of that madness came some of the greatest performances in history. Maybe chaos is the purest muse. Nothing inspires better than the fear of being pelted by cabbage in front of 2,000 people. The plays themselves were often soaked in the same wild energy. When Shakespeare wrote about betrayal, lust, or murder, his audience didn't see fantasy. They saw their own lives exaggerated in poetry. The butcher who'd quarreled with his wife that morning might watch Othello and nod in grim recognition. The young woman forced to marry an older man might whisper, "That's me," as Juliet spoke of forbidden love. The line between art and reality blurred so thoroughly that it's a wonder anyone remembered which side they were on. And perhaps that's the secret to their staying power. They weren't written for refined souls. They were written for people knee-deep in mud and emotion. Even the actors themselves weren't untouched by the city's filth. They dressed in costumes borrowed or stolen from noble estates. Heavy fabrics never meant to survive the sweat of human exertion. Their faces were caked with lead-based makeup that slowly poisoned them, and yet they smiled through every monologue. In an odd way, they were martyrs of entertainment, dying beautifully, one verse at a time. Some historians joke that the real tragedy of Hamlet wasn't the prince's death, but the actor's slow poisoning from cosmetics. There's a grim humor in that. Art imitating life, and life quietly killing art. It wasn't uncommon for an actor to faint mid-performance, overcome by heat and exhaustion. But no one left the stage. Fainting was just part of the act. The show went on, because it had to. There were no understudies waiting in the wings, no health regulations, no unions. Only the audience, restless and demanding. If you collapsed, someone would drag you to the back, pour ale on your face, and push you back under the lights. Passion wasn't optional, it was mandatory. And yet, amid this anarchy, there was brilliance. Shakespeare wrote with a kind of knowing irony, as if he understood that while his words reached for heaven, his audience was busy scratching themselves. His genius was in finding beauty in the absurd. He didn't ignore the filth, he used it. He turned the noise of the crowd into rhythm, their laughter into punctuation. He wrote for people who lived loudly, and in return, they gave his work a heartbeat that echoes even now. When people romanticize the golden age of theater, they often forget the rats. They forget the clouds of flies hovering above half-eaten food, the way the floorboards stuck to your shoes, the buzzing of humanity packed too tightly to breathe. But maybe that's why it worked. Maybe perfection kills art, and imperfection gives it soul. The Elizabethan theater was far from perfect. It was too alive for that. It was a living, sweating, stinking organism that refused to die, even when the city around it fell sick. There's something oddly comforting about that chaos. In a world obsessed with control, they found joy in losing it. We sanitize our stories now, clean our stages, dim the lights, and pretend we've evolved. But deep down, we miss that wildness. The thrill of sitting among strangers, unsure whether you will leave inspired or infected. It's the same impulse that drives us to concerts, protests, and crowded bars, that desperate human need to feel alive together, even if it's uncomfortable. Imagine standing in that pit, shoulder to shoulder with hundreds of others, the sun beating down, the smell of roasted nuts and unwashed hair in the air. You're laughing at a joke that's 400 years old, but it still works because human nature hasn't changed. People still lust, betray, drink too much, and dream beyond their means. The difference is that now we pretend to be civilized while doing it. They didn't bother pretending, and maybe that's why their laughter was louder. The theater wasn't an escape from the world, it was a reflection of it. Noisy, dirty, unpredictable, but gloriously human. Every cough, every heckle, every drunken cheer was part of the play. Life itself was the performance, and the audience knew it. Perhaps that's the truest kind of art. Not the kind you observe from a distance, but the kind that splashes on you, stains your clothes, and refuses to wash off. And, as the final line was spoken and the crowd erupted in applause, the actors bowed, not just to the audience, but to the chaos that had made it all possible. Because deep down, everyone there knew something that we keep forgetting. Beauty doesn't need purity. It thrives in the mess, the laughter, and the noise of being alive. And maybe, just maybe, that's why people kept coming back, even when the city smelled of death. Because in that filth and fever, they found something sacred. Something real. Something worth breathing, no matter how foul the air. By the time the sun began to set over the Thames, the theater had already transformed into something wild, a living organism made of noise, sweat, and secrets. It wasn't just about the words spoken on the stage, it was about the undercurrent of life that flowed beneath it. Behind the velvet curtains and the wooden scaffolds, there were whispers, transactions, betrayals, and pleasures that no playwright dared to write. The theater wasn't merely a place of art, it was a beating heart of human hunger, for money, for fame, for love, and for the kind of sin that only exists in the shadows of applause. If you slipped behind the stage during a performance, you wouldn't find quiet professionals preparing for their next scene. You'd find chaos, servants rushing with candles, stage hands arguing, actors flirting with anyone who would listen. The smell of sweat and candle wax filled the air, mixing with the damp wood and the faint sweetness of perfume. And amid that confusion, there were others, women who didn't belong to the troupe but seemed to move as if they owned the place. They were courtesans, lovers of nobles, mistresses of actors, or simply survivors in a world that paid better for sin than for honesty. Those backstage rooms, lit by flickering lanterns, saw as much drama as the plays themselves. A nobleman might sneak in through a side door to meet an actress, promising her jewels and eternal devotion, both of which would last about a week. An actor might boast of his latest conquest, only to find his wife waiting by the exit, armed with a rolling pin and righteous fury. Sometimes the stagehands would gather by the door just to listen to the arguments, laughing between the crashes of broken bottles. The theater was never short of passion. It simply overflowed in every direction. And perhaps that's what made the place so intoxicating. It wasn't simply entertainment, it was escape. For a few hours, you could pretend to be someone else, whether you were an actor or just another face in the crowd. The line between role and reality blurred until no one was entirely sure who they were playing anymore. Even the audience began to perform, dressing in their best clothes, flirting, boasting, pretending to be richer or nobler than they were. The theater wasn't a mirror held up to society. It was a mask that everyone wore together. But masks have a way of slipping. Beneath the laughter and the applause, there was something darker. Disease thrived in the heat of so many bodies pressed together. The same touch that passed a coin or a kiss could pass death. People spoke of the theater cough, a lingering sickness that clung to those who spent too much time in crowded spaces. Some even claimed the plague itself began in a playhouse, that laughter was as dangerous as infection. Perhaps there's truth in that. Art has always had a way of spreading ideas like contagion. When the outbreaks came, fear followed faster than the rats. Theaters were shut down by decree, wooden doors nailed shut, stages left to rot in silence. Actors scattered, many dying in the same anonymity they had tried so hard to escape. But when the plague waned, when the dead were buried and the air smelled less of death and more of rain, the people returned. They couldn't resist. The city could burn, the priests could condemn it, but the pull of the stage was stronger than morality or fear. There's something beautifully irrational about that. Human beings will risk everything for a story. They'll wade through filth, endure disease, and face death just to feel something. Maybe that's why the theater survived when so much else perished. It gave people what reality refused to, meaning. In a world where life was short, cruel, and dirty, those wooden planks offered a glimpse of eternity. For a brief moment, even a butcher or a beggar could feel immortal, laughing at a joke that would outlive them. And the actors? They knew this better than anyone. They weren't just performers, they were conjurers. They turned mud into gold, pain into poetry. Their voices could silence a mob or ignite it. They played kings and fools with equal conviction, knowing that once the curtain fell, they'd return to their rented rooms and unpaid debts. It's strange, isn't it, how art always seems to come from the ones who suffer most? Maybe tragedy is cheaper when you're already living it. But amid all the grime and grandeur, something else was growing, a sense of identity. The English theater became a reflection of the nation's restless spirit, bold, bawdy, and unafraid to stare at its own ugliness. Plays began to challenge authority, mock hypocrisy, and question God himself. What better place to do that than in a building already filled with sinners? The laughter that rose from those pits wasn't just amusement, it was defiance. Every cheer was a small rebellion against the strictness of the world outside. Even the clergy couldn't ignore it. They called the theaters dens of vice, claiming that the devil himself directed the plays. They weren't entirely wrong. There was something diabolical in the way people lost themselves there, how morality melted under the heat of shared laughter. But maybe that's what made it holy in its own way. Perhaps the devil and the divine were always closer than anyone dared admit, and the stage was the one place where both could coexist without shame. When you think about it, the Elizabethan theater was a kind of paradox, filthy and sacred, chaotic and poetic, decaying and eternal. It captured the entire human condition within its walls. Lust, laughter, faith, fear, disease, and redemption. You could find a saint and a thief sitting side by side, laughing at the same dirty joke. That's humanity distilled, not the sanitized version we like to pretend we are, but the real thing, sweating and breathing and pretending it isn't dying. And maybe that's the greatest lesson the old theaters left us. Art isn't meant to be clean. It isn't meant to comfort. It's meant to expose, to strip away the perfume and show us what we really are beneath the powder and lace. Those audiences didn't come for beauty alone. They came to see themselves, their hunger, their flaws, their laughter echoing against the wood and dust. They came to remember, if only for a few hours, that even in a world that stank of death, life could still be loud, messy, and magnificent. When the last candle burned out and the audience drifted back into the night, the silence that followed wasn't emptiness. It was satisfaction, the quiet hum of people who had just survived another day and celebrated it the only way they knew how, by losing themselves in someone else's story. And perhaps that's the secret Shakespeare understood better than anyone. The stage didn't just reflect the world, it redeemed it, one dirty, glorious performance at a time. Long after the last echoes of laughter faded, the theaters kept breathing. Those wooden skeletons that had seen more of human truth than any cathedral. What lingered wasn't just the memory of words, but the smell of them, the ghosts of sweat, candle smoke, and cheap ale. The planks that had soaked up spilled beer also soaked up history, and perhaps that's why stepping into one of those playhouses felt like walking into the lungs of London itself. The city exhaled through the stage, dirty, desperate, alive. And though centuries have passed, that breath still hangs in the air as if the world hasn't quite managed to wash it out. There's something fascinating about how beauty and decay have always lived side by side. The Elizabethans didn't separate them. They understood that one couldn't exist without the other. You couldn't have the poetry of Hamlet without the rats underfoot, nor the tragic fall of Lear without the audience shouting drunken advice from below. The smell of human imperfection was the perfume of truth. And maybe that's the difference between then and now. We've become obsessed with pretending that art is clean. We hide the dirt behind curtains and velvet ropes, forgetting that the dirt was the point all along. It's strange how people back then didn't see filth as shameful, but as proof of life. The same streets that reeked of garbage also echoed with music and laughter. People died young, so they lived loudly. They drank, they touched. They sang in public even when their voices cracked. Imagine trying that today, breaking into song on a crowded street. Someone would film you, someone else would judge you, and within minutes you become a meme. The Elizabethans didn't need validation. Their applause came from survival itself. And if we listen closely, their chaos sounds familiar. The world hasn't changed that much. It's just learned to wear deodorant. We still gather in crowded spaces to watch others act out our fears and desires. We still crave connection, still laugh at the grotesque, still mistake spectacle for salvation. Theaters have become cleaner, sure, but maybe they've lost something in the scrubbing. Maybe perfection sterilized the soul out of performance. You can almost hear the old actors laughing from the afterlife, saying, "You call that passion? Try delivering a soliloquy while dodging a flying sausage." Their laughter would echo off the old wooden beams that once groaned under the weight of thousands. Those beams have seen things no history book dares to describe. They've heard the screams of the crowd when a sword fight went too far, the moans from the lovers who couldn't wait until the final act, the thunder of rain pounding on the open roof as actors tried to shout over it. Everything was immediate, unscripted, real. Maybe that's what we miss most. The rawness of a world that didn't know how to fake authenticity because it didn't need to. Some nights, the line between the play and reality dissolved entirely. A man would collapse in the crowd, and for a moment no one knew whether it was part of the act. The audience would cheer, thinking it was a dramatic twist until the smell gave it away, the scent of something too real for fiction. And still, the show continued. The actors knew that nothing could stop the performance, not death, not plague, not the moral outrage of priests. Because in a world where everything was temporary, theater was the only thing that felt eternal. There's a certain humor in how history forgets the dirt, but remembers the words. We quote Shakespeare as if he wrote for scholars, but his words were made for the muddy, the drunk, the heartbroken, and the human. His verses weren't designed for marble halls, but for people who couldn't afford to wash every day. He wrote for laughter through rotten teeth and tears wiped with dirty sleeves. And yet, somehow, those words survive. Maybe because they were never too proud to be touched by grime. If you imagine those audiences now, it's almost cinematic. The flickering torchlight painting everyone's faces in gold, the glimmer of jewelry beside a lice-ridden wig, the mingling of perfume and unwashed bodies. Everyone pretending for a few hours that the world made sense. The crowd didn't just watch tragedy, they lived it daily. So when they wept for Romeo or roared for Falstaff, it wasn't theater, it was recognition. The actors gave them permission to feel in public, something most people still struggle to do in private. And that's the strange beauty of it. The filth made the emotion real. The same hands that threw rotten fruit could also wipe away a tear. The same mouth that heckled a speech could shout in awe at a perfect line. There was no hypocrisy in that contradiction, only honesty. Humans contain both disgust and wonder, and nowhere was that more visible than in those cramped wooden circles along the Thames. Perhaps that's why the ghosts never left. If you stand in the reconstructed globe today and close your eyes, you can still feel them. The laughter, the fights, the raw electricity of being alive together in one unfiltered moment. The floorboards may be cleaner, the audience quieter, but the spirit is the same. The stage still hums with something ancient and defiant, something that refuses to be civilized. We've built walls between ourselves and our past, convinced that progress means distance from discomfort. But the Elizabethans knew a secret we've forgotten, that filth and beauty aren't opposites. They're dance partners. One makes the other possible. Without decay, there's no growth. Without chaos, there's no story. Theaters then weren't sanctuaries from the world, they were its reflection, warped and wild and wonderfully alive. So when we think of that era, of the mud, the madness, the laughter echoing over the smell of humanity, maybe we shouldn't wrinkle our noses. Maybe we should envy them, because they understood something we're still trying to relearn, that art doesn't come from comfort, and truth never smells like perfume. It smells like life, rich, strange, terrible, and unforgettable. And maybe that's why, centuries later, we're still talking about them, because somewhere deep down we miss the honesty of that filth. We miss being surrounded by strangers who didn't pretend to be perfect. We miss the noise, the danger, the chaos that reminded us we were part of something bigger than ourselves. The Elizabethans didn't go to the theater to escape life, they went to drown in it. And when the curtain fell and the stench followed them home, they carried a piece of that truth with them, the reminder that beauty and decay have always been the same thing, wearing different costumes under the same dim light. When the last torch was snuffed out and the crowd spilled into the dark alleys of London, something lingered. Not the echo of applause, but the aftertaste of chaos. The theaters were quiet again, but silence in Elizabethan London never meant peace. It meant the city was catching its breath before the next scandal. By morning, the same people who had cheered for lovers and murderers on stage were back in the mud, selling fish, carrying buckets, gossiping about who fainted in the pit or who had been caught behind the bleachers. Theater was never just entertainment. It was the pulse of a restless city, pretending to behave by day and confessing everything by night. It's almost poetic how life outside the theater mirrored the madness within it. London itself was a stage, and everyone was acting. Merchants strutted like kings, beggars rehearsed their misery, priests delivered sermons as if auditioning for the lead in a tragedy. The boundary between performance and existence blurred until no one could tell where the show ended. Even the Queen, majestic, powdered, untouchable, was a performer. Her throne a grander stage, her court a theater of flatterers and rivals. Perhaps that's why she loved the plays so much. She recognized herself in them. But for the ordinary Londoner, the theater was something holier than the church. Inside those rough timbered walls, you could scream, cry, laugh, and no one would judge you. It was the only place where a poor man's emotions were allowed to be grand. In church, he was a sinner. In the theater, he was human. And maybe that's why the clergy hated it, not because it was wicked, but because it was free. Nothing frightens power more than a crowd discovering that they can feel together without permission. It's amusing how the very things that made the theater scandalous are what make it timeless. The filth, the noise, the contradictions, all the imperfections that polite society tried to hide ended up becoming the soul of the art. We've spent centuries trying to polish what the Elizabethans celebrated in its rawness. They didn't need perfect lighting or sound design. They had life itself, unpredictable and loud. Their plays were powered by the same energy that drives every argument in a pub, every heartbreak, every desperate laugh. And maybe that's why we still recognize ourselves in them. Because deep down we haven't changed. We've just learned to use deodorant and denial. Some nights, when the moon hung low and the river smelled of salt and smoke, people swore they could hear ghosts near the globe. Not the kind that haunt out of anger, but out of longing. Actors who couldn't bear to leave the stage, lovers who never made it to the end of the play. London was a city that didn't believe in clean endings. Everything bled into something else. Laughter into crying, sin into confession, death into applause. That strange mixture, that refusal to separate beauty from dirt, gave the place its heartbeat. You can imagine what it felt like to stand there among the crowd, the laughter rolling like thunder, The smell of roasted nuts and wet wool, the feeling that you were part of something larger than yourself. The plays were never about escape. They were about recognition. When a character betrayed a friend, the butcher in the crowd remembered his own lie. When a fool made a crude joke, the nobleman laughed too loudly, revealing more than he meant to. The stage wasn't a mirror. It was a confession booth that everyone shared. And what's curious is how that same mess, that same noise, still clings to us centuries later. We've built prettier theaters, softer seats, stricter rules, but the longing is the same. We still crave stories that let us see ourselves without the filter of dignity. Maybe that's why modern audiences cry in the dark. It's the only time they're allowed to be honest. In Elizabethan London, you didn't need darkness for that. You just needed courage and a mug of ale. There's a delicious irony in how the filth of those old theaters became the foundation of the most revered literature in English history. Shakespeare, who wrote for drunkards and pickpockets, is now studied by scholars who sanitize every word. They dissect his plays like surgeons, searching for meaning in the bones while ignoring the blood. But the real genius wasn't in the structure of his sentences. It was in the chaos that surrounded them. His brilliance was that he didn't write above the noise. He wrote through it. He knew that life's music is made of both harmony and interruption. And isn't that the essence of humanity? We keep trying to script our lives, to make sense of the unscripted. We want our stories to be clean, but they never are. We spill things. We forget lines. We step on each other's cues. The Elizabethans accepted that. They didn't demand perfection from the world because they didn't expect it from themselves. Maybe that's the lesson buried beneath the centuries of perfume and polish. That being human means embracing the smell, the noise, the imperfection of it all. Sometimes I wonder what those people would think if they could see us now. Would they envy our comfort or pity our restraint? Would they laugh at how quiet our theaters are, how afraid we are to make a sound? They lived louder, risked more, felt deeper, not because they were better, but because the world didn't give them the luxury of pretending. Every day was a gamble. Every laugh might be their last. And maybe that's why they found beauty in filth being what? Because they knew it wouldn't last. The wooden walls of those playhouses may have crumbled long ago, but the echoes remain. They're in every story told on screen, every laugh that breaks through tragedy, every moment when the line between real and imagined dissolves. The Elizabethans gave us more than plays. They gave us permission to be messy, to love wildly, to cry without shame, to find poetry in places that smell like sweat and death and something living underneath it all. And that's why the theater endures. Because long after the words are forgotten, the feeling remains. That spark of recognition, that laughter born out of filth, that fleeting, perfect moment when everyone in the room breathes the same air and realizes they're part of the same strange, beautiful story. It's not about Shakespeare or London or the plague. It's about us, still trying after all these centuries to find meaning in the noise, to turn our own chaos into something worth applauding. Maybe that's the truest legacy of the Elizabethan theater. It reminds us that art doesn't save us from the mess. It baptizes us in it. It teaches us to find grace, not in what's clean, but in what's real. And as long as we can still laugh, still ache, still lose ourselves for a moment in someone else's story, the ghosts of those filthy, glorious playhouses will never really die. They'll be right here, in every stage, every screen, every trembling silence before the lights go out and the world begins again. By the time the 17th century dawned, London's theaters had already seen everything: love, death, laughter, rebellion, and enough bodily fluids to fill the Thames twice over. Yet the story wasn't finished. It was merely shifting, like the city itself. The world was changing. The plague had made sure of that. People had looked death in the eye so often that they started craving something more refined, cleaner, more civilized. But, of course, civilization is just the art of hiding the dirt under a prettier rug. Theaters didn't become purer. They just learned to disguise their sins behind thicker curtains. The nobles began to dominate the upper galleries, wrapping themselves in lace and moral superiority while pretending not to notice what was still happening in the pit below. The same men who condemned the noise of commoners were sneaking backstage to whisper offers to actresses, or to the young male apprentices who still played female roles. Society was perfecting its favorite illusion: hypocrisy. The theater didn't clean itself. It evolved into something far more interesting, a reflection of a world pretending to be clean while still rolling in its own mud. Behind those elegant performances, the reality was unchanged. The makeup was still poisonous, the costumes still crawling with fleas, and the actors still starving between performances. Some nights, they'd sell personal belongings just to afford a loaf of bread, then go on stage and deliver speeches about kings and honor. It's darkly funny if you think about it. A man playing a royal in front of a cheering crowd while his real stomach growled louder than the audience. The irony was so thick you could slice it with a prop dagger. But maybe that was the charm of it all. The theater wasn't meant to be perfect. It was meant to be alive. Each show was a gamble. The weather, the crowd, the health of the actors, the state of the stage itself, all conspired to decide whether the night would be magic or mayhem. And when the wind blew just right, When the torches flickered like stars and the audience leaned forward together, something transcendent happened. You could almost forget the lice, the smell, and the drunks arguing in the back. For a moment, London didn't feel like a city of filth and fear. It felt human. Yet the very thing that made it human, that beautiful mess, was also what terrified those in power. The Puritans saw the theaters as breeding grounds for sin, places where laughter loosened the moral seams of society. They weren't entirely wrong. People did forget their place there. Servants mocked their masters in the pit. Women laughed too loudly. Desire hung in the air thicker than the smoke. It was freedom disguised as entertainment, and freedom is always dangerous to those who need order. So, when the Puritans finally took control, they shut it all down. The stages were torn apart, actors arrested, costumes burned. Theaters that had once pulsed with laughter and music became silent carcasses of wood and dust. For nearly 2 decades, the sound of applause vanished from England. Imagine it, an entire generation that never saw a play, never heard that collective gasp when a line struck too deep. The soul of the city was gagged in the name of purity. But purity, as history loves to prove, is fragile. People can only live in silence for so long before they start humming again. In secret taverns and candlelit rooms, forbidden plays were whispered, reenacted, and remembered. Some say the actors themselves refused to give it up, that they performed in barns and fields, anywhere they could gather a few souls hungry for a story. It wasn't rebellion for fame, it was survival for meaning. The theater had become something sacred, a kind of faith that needed no altar, only an audience. And when the theaters finally reopened, London erupted like a city reborn. The laughter came louder, the stories bolder, the costumes brighter. It was as if the silence had fermented, making the joy stronger when it finally returned. New playwrights emerged, new scandals, new kings of the stage. But that raw, filthy soul of the Elizabethan theater still lived beneath the polish. It never really died. It just waited for the world to remember how to breathe again. It's fascinating how everything cycles. Filth to order, chaos to control, laughter to silence, and back again. Humanity can't help itself. It keeps rediscovering its appetite for imperfection. Every time society decides it's too refined for raw emotion, something cracks. The laughter leaks through. Maybe that's the true legacy of those early playhouses. Not the architecture or the scripts, but the reminder that art can't be contained by cleanliness. It thrives in noise and contradiction, in the places polite company pretends not to look. Even today, when people sit in perfect rows with their phones silenced, the ghost of that old chaos lingers. Somewhere deep down, every audience still wants to throw something at the stage, to shout advice to Hamlet, to laugh when they shouldn't. We pretend we've evolved, but the same hunger lives beneath our manners. The Elizabethans didn't invent theater. They simply stripped it down to its essence. The beautiful, smelly, unpredictable heart of being human. And maybe that's why, when we think of those times, we feel both disgusted and jealous. They lived closer to the truth. Their streets were filthy, their lives short, their nights loud, but they felt everything, fully, shamelessly, without filters. The same people who stepped over sewage on their way to the theater would stand there and weep over words that still move us centuries later. They understood something we've almost forgotten, that art doesn't need to rise above the world to matter. It only needs to dive deep enough to touch it. So when we look back at those wooden theaters and the wild souls who filled them, maybe we shouldn't pity them for their ignorance or their filth. Maybe we should envy their courage. They dared to live without pretending. They dared to laugh at tragedy and find beauty in decay. And perhaps the greatest act of theater wasn't on the stage at all. It was in the audience itself. Thousands of flawed, noisy, mortal beings gathered together, proving with every cheer and gasp that even in the dirtiest corners of existence, the human spirit still knows how to rise. And just like that, the curtain never really falls. It just waits, trembling in the dark, ready for the next voice, the next breath, the next eruption of laughter that reminds the world what it truly means to be alive. There's something eerie about how time forgets the smell but remembers the sound. The laughter that once echoed through the wooden ribs of the old playhouses didn't vanish. It seeped into the bones of the city, buried beneath the cobblestones and the centuries of polite silence that followed. Even now, if you stand near the banks of the Thames when the wind turns cold, you can almost hear it. The roar of the crowd, the snap of applause, the chaos of 1,000 lives momentarily united by the illusion of story. London may have changed its clothes, but its voice remains the same. The truth is that every era likes to pretend it's cleaner than the one before. The Victorians, with their corsets and moral panic, tried to erase the stains left by the Elizabethans, as if shame could be scrubbed with soap. But no matter how tightly society laces its gloves, the dirt always finds a way back under the fingernails. They rebuilt the city with bricks and propriety, yet the ghosts of those bawdy theaters whispered from every alleyway. Even the grand opera houses that replaced them couldn't escape the same old hunger. The audience still wanted to be moved, shocked, seduced, forgiven. Civilization doesn't change what the heart wants. It only teaches it better manners. And that's what makes the story of those filthy, magnificent theaters so strangely human. They remind us that art was never born in marble halls. It came from the streets, from the hands of laborers who reeked of sweat and smoke, from the laughter of women who weren't supposed to speak so loudly, from the actors who lived on the edge of respectability and starvation. The theater was the original rebellion, a cathedral built on chaos where people could confess without kneeling. It's funny, in a bittersweet way, that something so raw would one day be studied in quiet classrooms by students too afraid to raise their voices. If Shakespeare could walk into one of those modern classrooms, he'd probably yawn halfway through his own monologue. He wrote for people who lived, not for people who analyzed. His words were meant to be shouted, cheered, spit out with beer on the breath, and that's the beauty of it. His art survived not because it was pure, but because it was alive. Every time a teenager somewhere rolls their eyes at Hamlet, the playwright probably smiles from the afterlife. At least they're feeling something. Indifference would be a worse fate than misunderstanding. It's strange how we sanitize passion once it becomes history. We turn human chaos into academic order, as if that makes it easier to admire from a distance. But the truth is, the closer you get to the Elizabethan world, the harder it is to keep your hands clean. You can't study their theater without stepping into the mud, without smelling the sweat, without hearing the laughter that wasn't polite but real. Their art didn't ask for reverence. It demanded participation. You weren't just a spectator, you were part of the spectacle. You could heckle, cry, argue, flirt, or faint, and no one would stop the play. Maybe that's why the experience was unforgettable, because it wasn't safe. Modern audiences, with their silent seats and overpriced tickets, might envy that danger without realizing it. Today, we stream our stories from sanitized screens, each of us isolated in our own private pit. We've traded the stink of humanity for the sterile glow of pixels. It's comfortable, yes, but comfort rarely creates memory. No one leaves a Netflix binge trembling with the feeling that they've touched something sacred. Maybe that's why the ghosts of the old theater still linger. They're waiting for us to remember how to feel without filters again. And there's something almost comic about how history repeats itself in disguise. Every generation thinks it's the first to mix art with scandal, politics with pleasure, intellect with instinct. But the Elizabethans did it all centuries ago without apology. Their plays mocked kings, exposed hypocrisy, and laughed at their own misery. They turned the dirt of everyday life into gold. Perhaps that's why they were so feared. Because laughter, when it's honest, is the most subversive sound in the world. It tells the truth in a language even tyrants can't silence. The theater was, in its way, the city's nervous system. Every tremor of society pulsed through it. When war loomed, the plays grew darker. When peace returned, they burst into comedy again. It wasn't entertainment so much as emotional survival. In a time when books were scarce and life was cheap, stories became the currency of the soul. And the audiences, no matter how loud or filthy, paid in full attention. They didn't scroll past boredom. They drank it, they argued with it, they lived inside it. Imagine that, being so desperate for meaning that you'd stand for hours in the rain just to watch someone pretend to die for love. There's a certain humility in that devotion, something we've lost in our age of abundance. Back then, every word mattered because it was fleeting. The actors could forget their lines, the audience could riot, the plague could close the theater by morning. Nothing was guaranteed. That fragility made the experience sacred. Today, we replay, rewind, and rewatch. But they only had one chance. And maybe that's what gave their laughter its edge. When you know life could end tomorrow, every joke feels like defiance. It's easy to romanticize the past, but the truth is, those people weren't noble heroes of art. They were messy, contradictory, deeply human beings trying to survive. They didn't go to the theater for enlightenment. They went because they were tired, heartbroken, hungry, and needed to forget for a while. Maybe that's the most honest reason of all. We still do the same thing, only now our stages glow from screens instead of candles. We're still chasing that same illusion, that for a few precious moments we can step outside ourselves and live someone else's story. And maybe that's why the old theaters refuse to fade. Because beneath their mud and madness lies the purest form of what it means to be human, to gather, to listen, to feel, to laugh in the face of misery. Every modern theater, every cinema, every story told in the dark is just an echo of that ancient heartbeat. The world may have changed its costumes, but the performance goes on, just as chaotic, just as absurd, and just as beautiful. So when you think of those Elizabethan playhouses, don't imagine them as relics of a primitive age. Imagine them as mirrors that still reflect us, uncomfortably and truthfully. They remind us that art was never meant to be tidy, that laughter doesn't need manners, and that beauty often crawls out of filth. Maybe that's what makes the theater immortal. It never pretends to be perfect, it just insists on being alive. And in a world that keeps trying to polish the rough edges of existence, perhaps that is the bravest act of all. Sometimes, when we look back at those centuries, it feels almost impossible to believe that something so chaotic, so filthy, could give birth to something so eternal. But maybe eternity was never meant to be clean. Maybe the reason those words, those stories, those wooden stages still matter is because they were soaked in real life, in laughter, in sweat, in noise, in the smell of ale and desperation. History loves to smooth the wrinkles out of its own face, but the truth is always rough. And there's something beautiful in that, in knowing that art, real art, doesn't grow from silence or polish, but from the mess we all try so hard to hide. London was a city constantly reinventing itself. Like an actor who refuses to leave the stage even when the play is over, fires would devour whole neighborhoods, plagues would thin the crowds, and yet every time the city came back louder. Maybe it was resilience, maybe it was stubbornness, or maybe London just didn't know how to shut up. Theaters mirrored that spirit. They burned down, they rotted, they were banned, rebuilt, condemned, and still they returned. Like weeds growing through cobblestones, they refused to die. There's a kind of divine comedy in that humanity's loudest voices come from the things everyone tries hardest to silence. The truth is, the theater has always been a bit of a scandal. Even when it tried to behave, it couldn't help itself. It attracted dreamers, liars, lovers, and lunatics, and sometimes they were all the same person. Imagine a world where actors doubled as carpenters, costumers, and occasional thieves. They rehearsed while drinking, performed while feverish, and fought in the streets when the curtain fell. But out of that chaos came moments that still break hearts. It's almost funny, really, that some of the greatest words ever spoken were written by men who could barely afford a candle to write by. And that's the thing about the Elizabethans. They lived close to the edge. Everything was temporary. Fame, health, even sunlight. You could be a star one week and buried the next. But maybe that's why their art burned so brightly. When life is fragile, you live faster, you love harder, you laugh louder. There's something honest about people who know they might die tomorrow and still decide to put on a show today. It makes our modern anxieties look almost cute by comparison. They worried about plague. We panic when the Wi-Fi drops for 2 minutes. Perspective is humbling, isn't it? Of course, the audience was no better. They were part of the performance, unpredictable, wild, and gloriously human. You couldn't impress them with fancy lighting or sound effects. They wanted emotion, blood, and jokes they could repeat in the tavern afterward. If the actors faltered, the crowd would heckle them mercilessly. Imagine trying to deliver Hamlet's soliloquy while someone in the front row yells, "Get on with it!" It sounds brutal, but maybe that honesty was freeing. There was no pretense of refinement, just a raw transaction between those who told the story and those who needed to hear it. In many ways, those crowds were the first critics. But unlike today's reviewers, they didn't hide behind essays. Their feedback came in the form of laughter, jeers, or sometimes a well-aimed apple core. Brutal honesty, immediate response, no buffering. And yet, that constant friction kept the theater alive. It forced writers to evolve, actors to adapt, and audiences to stay alert. The relationship was messy, yes, but it was also electric. Proof that art isn't supposed to be a polite exchange. It's a collision, a beautiful, necessary collision between what we see and what we feel, and maybe that's the part that still haunts us. We've spent centuries trying to separate the two, to draw neat lines between performance and life, stage and spectator, but those old playhouses remind us there is no separation. We're all part of the act, still pretending, still performing, still searching for meaning in a world that refuses to stay quiet. Every laugh, every heartbreak, every awkward silence in a theater today is a faint echo of those first noisy, smelly crowds who discovered that telling stories was the only way to stay sane. There's something strangely comforting in that thought, that no matter how modern we become, our hearts still crave the same chaos. We still want to feel connected, to lose ourselves in a story that makes us forget we're ordinary. The faces have changed, the clothes, the accents, the light, but the hunger hasn't. And perhaps that's why, when we sit in a dark room, waiting for the curtain to rise, we feel something ancient stirring. It's the same pulse that moved through the globe, the same fire that flickered in those torches, the same unspoken agreement. We're all here for a little while, to believe in something together. It's easy to laugh at how crude those times were, to imagine ourselves superior with our modern hygiene and comfortable seats. But maybe they were richer in a way we've forgotten. They didn't separate art from life because they couldn't afford to. The same hands that built ships and dug graves also clapped for Shakespeare. The same mouths that shouted insults at the stage whispered prayers at night. There was no division between the sacred and the profane, because everything was both. Life didn't wait to be curated, it was lived loudly and without apology. And in that noise, something eternal was born. A reminder that art is not a luxury. It's a necessity. It's what keeps us human when the world turns cold. The Elizabethans understood that better than most. They didn't need silence to find truth. They found it in the shouting, in the dirt, in the laughter that rose above everything else. Maybe that's why their legacy endures. Because they dared to show that beauty doesn't exist in spite of the mess, but because of it. When the lights dim and the room grows still, that same truth hangs in the air. The centuries collapse into a single heartbeat, and for a fleeting moment, we are them. dirty, loud, fragile, and alive. That's the secret no historian can scrub away. The theaters were never about perfection. They were about connection. And as long as there are people willing to gather, to listen, to laugh at the absurdity of being human, the show, against all odds, against time itself, will always go on. They say the past never really dies. It just hides behind new costumes, waiting for its cue to reappear. And in some way, the spirit of those Elizabethan playhouses never left us. It clings to every theater, every cinema, every screen glowing in the dark. It lingers in that electric moment before the story begins, when the world outside dissolves and hundreds of strangers agree without words to dream the same dream. That moment, when time bends and breath synchronizes, is older than Shakespeare, older than London, older than language itself. The Elizabethans simply gave it a home made of wood, laughter, and sin. If you could walk through the globe at its height, you'd feel it instantly, the pulse of something bigger than entertainment. The ground would tremble under the feet of 1,000 restless souls, and the air would vibrate with a kind of hunger that wasn't just for story, but for release. People came not to escape reality, but to confront it, to wrestle with it in the open air. Life was short, brutal, uncertain, and theater gave it shape. It turned the chaos into poetry, the despair into rhythm. Every tragedy was a reminder that death was coming anyway, so why not cry beautifully on the way there? And yet, despite all its grandeur, there was still comedy in everything. Life itself was the biggest joke of all, and the Elizabethans knew it. They didn't separate humor from tragedy the way we try to. They laughed at death and wept at joy because they understood how fragile the line really was. Imagine an audience howling with laughter one moment and gasping the next. A sea of muddy faces lit by torchlight, suspended between rapture and disgust. There was no right way to react, only honesty. Maybe that's why their stories still feel alive. They were written for people who didn't know how to fake their emotions. It's funny how we've learned to hide behind politeness since then. Today, people applaud because they're supposed to, not because they can't help it. We whisper in theaters like we're visiting a church, forgetting that theater was the church once. The loud, blasphemous kind where everyone shouted their confessions at once. The Elizabethans understood something sacred in noise, in imperfection, in the collective mess of being alive together. Maybe we've lost that courage, trading passion for posture. We worry too much about behaving and not enough about feeling. But those old stages didn't just entertain, they infected. The ideas born there didn't stay contained within the playhouse walls. They spread through the city like smoke, seeping into politics, religion, even daily speech. People quoted lines they didn't fully understand, the way we quote movies now. Words that began as theater slang ended up in the English language itself, proof that art doesn't just reflect culture, it rewrites it. Every insult, every love confession, every drunken joke that passed through the globe's rafters left fingerprints on our modern tongue. We still speak with their ghosts. And the actors, those strange creatures balanced between celebrity and poverty, became both idols and scapegoats. They lived loudly, dangerously, and never quite belonged anywhere. One day adored, the next condemned. They were loved by queens and hunted by preachers. Maybe that's the price of truth. When you show people their own faces too clearly, they either worship you or try to burn you. Yet the actors endured, fueled by applause and ale, by the fleeting ecstasy of pretending to be someone else. Some of them died poor, others nameless, but their voices, those words outlived kings. There's something oddly comforting about that, isn't there? To think that while the towers of London crumbled and the rulers came and went, a few scribbled lines from a man who wrote by candlelight managed to survive everything. The globe itself was burned to the ground once, set ablaze by its own gunpowder effects during a performance. You'd think that would have been the end of it, but within a year, it was rebuilt, stronger, grander, louder. That's the most poetic metaphor imaginable for human nature. We burn down the things we love and then rush to resurrect them, convinced that this time it'll last. Even centuries later, when the modern reconstruction of the globe opened, people wept, as if a lost memory had been returned to them. Maybe it wasn't nostalgia, it was recognition. A quiet reminder that somewhere beneath our Wi-Fi and glass towers, we're still those same creatures of noise and need, gathering around stories to feel less alone. The ghosts of those theaters didn't vanish. They just learned to speak through new mediums, through film, through screens, through the endless scroll of stories that now live in our palms. The audience hasn't changed. Only the lighting has. It's easy to romanticize it all, to imagine the past as something pure, but the truth is messier and far more interesting. Those theaters were built on contradictions, art and filth, holiness and lust, laughter and fear. They were proof that beauty doesn't bloom in sterile soil. It grows where life is most alive, where people risk embarrassment, heartbreak, and failure in front of strangers. That's why the Elizabethans' world still captivates us. It wasn't polished, but it was real. And the real, no matter how dirty, always outlasts the artificial. When you think about it, the theater was never really about performance. It was about connection. The magic wasn't in the script or the stage, but in the audience itself, in the way hundreds of strangers could share a heartbeat for a few moments. That's the secret that has kept the art alive across centuries. We don't go to watch stories. We go to remember we're human. And as long as there's a stage or a screen or even just a voice daring to tell the truth out loud, that same pulse will keep beating. So maybe the Elizabethans weren't the dirty, uncivilized ancestors we imagine. Maybe they were closer to something we've forgotten, something raw, essential, untamed. They understood that art wasn't meant to be comfortable. It was meant to challenge, to provoke, to remind us that life itself is theater, and we're all players stumbling through our lines, improvising our way toward meaning. And as the last candle burned down in those crowded playhouses, and the night swallowed the laughter and the noise, something sacred lingered in the air, a promise whispered from one century to the next. The story isn't over. It never was. It just waits, patiently, for the next generation to find the courage to lift the curtain again. If you listen closely, you can almost hear them still, the distant echo of voices rising from a stage that no longer exists, the laughter that shook wooden rafters now long turned to dust. The globe and its kindred theaters may have vanished centuries ago, but their ghosts never left. They linger in every gasp of an audience, in every nervous breath before the curtain rises, in every moment when a story reminds us of who we really are. And maybe that's the most haunting part of all, the realization that while the buildings died, the hunger that built them never did. Humanity still craves the same thing it did 400 years ago, the chance to see itself reflected, ridiculous and raw, in someone else's spotlight. Those first audiences were rough around the edges, loud and unapologetically alive. They didn't care about etiquette or whispering during a performance. They came for the thrill, for the connection, for the spectacle. They came to feel something. And perhaps that's why the smell didn't bother them, why the noise didn't stop them, because in that chaos there was freedom. The freedom to laugh too loud, to cry without shame, to shout when the moment demanded it. Imagine that kind of honesty today. If someone even sneezes in a modern theater, people glare like they've committed a crime against culture. Back then the crime was not reacting. It's strange to think that what began in such filth and noise became the foundation of English art and identity. The same world that once threw rotten fruit at actors now quotes their words in marble halls. There's something ironic about that. The upper classes who once sneered at the common theater ended up worshiping it centuries later. Time has a wicked sense of humor. It polishes what it once condemned, forgets the stench, and calls it genius. Maybe that's how history works. It's just gossip written by the survivors. But for all the romantic stories we tell about Shakespeare's era, the reality was more complicated. The stage wasn't some noble sanctuary of art. It was a battlefield of ego, ambition, and desperation. Actors competed for attention, playwrights fought for payment, audiences demanded blood or laughter, whichever came first. And through it all, the show had to go on. It always does. There's something beautifully stubborn about that phrase. The show must go on. It was true when the plague shut the theaters, when actors fainted from heat, when an audience brawl interrupted a scene. They'd drag the body away, mop the blood, and pick up where they left off. Maybe that's why theater feels eternal, because it's built on the purest form of survival instinct. And yet, amid all the noise and grime, the Elizabethans stumbled onto something profound. They learned that the stage wasn't just a place to pretend, it was a place to reveal. Every play, every performance, was a confession disguised as entertainment. A poor man could stand in the mud and watch a king lose everything and think, maybe I'm not so cursed after all. A nobleman could see a fool mock power and secretly admire his courage. The stage made everyone equal for a few hours, bound by the same illusions. That's the funny thing about pretending. Sometimes it tells more truth than reality ever could. If you strip away the centuries, you realize that nothing about us has changed. We still seek distraction, still crave meaning, still build our temples of entertainment on top of the ruins of yesterday's sins. Theaters may smell better now, but the hearts inside them are the same. We still laugh at tragedy, still cry at comedy, still find beauty in the wrong places. And we still forget, far too often, that art isn't supposed to comfort us. It's supposed to confront us. The Elizabethans understood that instinctively. They didn't go to the theater to escape. They went to face the chaos head-on, together. Sometimes I think we envy their honesty. They lived so close to death that they couldn't afford to lie about life. Every story meant something because every day might be the last. That's what gave their laughter its sharpness and their tears their weight. Modern audiences have forgotten that feeling. We assume we have endless time, so we treat stories like decoration instead of revelation. But for them, a play wasn't just a pastime, it was a rehearsal for mortality. Watching someone die on stage wasn't entertainment, it was a warning and a promise. This too will happen to you, so live while you can. And yet, even with that grim awareness, they never stopped laughing. Maybe that's what kept them sane. Humor was the Elizabethans' secret weapon, their way of spitting in death's face. Even their tragedies were laced with wit because they understood that despair without laughter becomes unbearable. There's something incredibly human in that balance. They didn't separate the sacred from the absurd because they knew life never did. A man could bury his child in the morning and still find himself laughing at a joke by sunset, not because he didn't care, but because he had to. Laughter was their rebellion against despair. It's hard not to admire that resilience. They turned suffering into spectacle, ugliness into art, chaos into rhythm. They took the worst of life and turned it into something worth clapping for. There's a lesson in that for every generation. The beauty doesn't come from avoiding pain, but from transforming it. Maybe that's why those words still echo, why those plays still breathe. They remind us that nothing is too broken to be made beautiful, not even us. And somewhere in the vast theater of the modern world, lit not by torches but by screens, the same story continues. We gather in the dark, searching for reflection, for relief, for that old feeling of being part of something bigger than ourselves. The settings have changed, but the need hasn't. We still ache for connection, for meaning, for laughter in the middle of fear. The Elizabethans knew that art was never about escape. It was about endurance, the ability to keep laughing, keep crying, keep feeling, no matter how dirty, how loud, or how fleeting the world becomes. Maybe that's the true legacy of those old playhouses. Not the words carved in textbooks, not the dusty costumes or crumbling foundations, but the reminder that life itself is theater, and that every one of us is both audience and actor, stumbling through our roles, improvising our lines, praying the curtain doesn't fall too soon. And when it finally does, maybe the only applause we need is the echo of our own laughter, still ringing in the dark, somewhere between the mud and the poetry, between the smell of sweat and the sound of laughter. The Elizabethans stumbled upon a secret that still haunts us. Stories are not made to entertain, they're made to remind us we exist. And existence, as they knew too well, was messy. You could be laughing in the morning and coughing up death by nightfall. Maybe that's why they craved the theater so desperately. It was the only place where life and death could share a stage without pretending to understand each other. The beauty of it all was how accidental it seemed. Nobody set out to create eternal art. They were just trying to survive another day, to fill the hours before the plague or poverty decided their turn had come. Shakespeare wasn't a prophet writing for immortality. He was a man paying rent with words, feeding off the chaos of the world around him. And somehow, in that ordinary struggle, he touched something timeless. It's funny, isn't it? The words that outlived empires began as entertainment for people who couldn't afford a chair. Maybe that's what made those stories so real. They weren't born from comfort or philosophy, but from necessity. The audience didn't come for enlightenment. They came to feel, to laugh at fools, to cry for heroes, to forget their hunger or their guilt for a few hours. And yet, what they left with was something more lasting, a strange, quiet understanding that everyone, no matter how different, shares the same trembling heart. In a world divided by class, religion, and disease, the theater was the one place where everyone could breathe the same foul air and, for once, feel equal. That feeling of being together in the chaos might be the rarest thing of all. Today, we're surrounded by screens connected to everyone and no one at the same time. The Elizabethans had no technology, but they had presence. The smell of another human beside you, the sound of their laughter blending with yours, that was communion. Crude, loud, sweaty communion, but communion nonetheless. We've traded that for the glow of our devices, for stories that we consume alone, silently. Maybe progress isn't always a straight line. Maybe we just found cleaner ways to feel lonelier. And yet, even in our distance, we still carry their hunger. The same longing that filled those wooden arenas still beats in us. We still crave stories that make sense of the senseless, that turn the filth of life into something bearable, maybe even beautiful. We like to think we've evolved, that we're more refined than those groundlings covered in mud, but the truth is humbling. We're the same creatures, just better dressed. The same fears, the same laughter, the same endless search for meaning hiding behind jokes and tears. If we stripped away the technology and the polish, we'd find we haven't moved an inch in 4 centuries. The irony is that the Elizabethans might have been freer than we are. They didn't pretend their lives were tidy. They didn't hide their ugliness or sanitize their joy. Their theater was proof that humanity doesn't need perfection to be profound. It only needs honesty. It's amusing how often we confuse the two. We chase perfection like it's salvation, scrubbing the world until it looks sterile, but perfection is just another mask. The Elizabethans, for all their filth, didn't wear masks. They wore their truth like armor. Maybe that's why their art lasted while empires crumbled. There's a story about how, after a performance, actors would mingle with the crowd, drinking, laughing, even fighting alongside the same people who had just watched them play kings. The illusion ended the moment the curtain fell. There was no separation between art and life, because for them it was all the same thing. Can you imagine that today? An Oscar-winning actor stumbling into a bar full of fans, sword in hand, still quoting lines from their last scene? They'd go viral in minutes, but back then, it was just another Thursday. The boundary between fiction and reality didn't need to be guarded. It was celebrated. And maybe that's what the theater gave them. Not escape, but reflection. It held up a mirror so close that it burned. The audience laughed at the drunkard on stage and saw themselves. They cheered for the hero and felt braver. They wept for the doomed lovers and remembered their own heartbreak. The stage wasn't a fantasy. It was an X-ray. It showed what was hidden beneath the layers of dirt and pride and fear. The funny part is that same mirror still works. We just call it cinema now, or streaming, or social media. Different tools, same desperate need to see ourselves. Sometimes I wonder what those audiences would think if they saw us now, sitting alone in spotless rooms, faces lit by screens, emotions processed in silence. Would they envy our comfort or pity our distance? They might laugh at how hard we try to control what they embraced so freely. Life, for them, was theater. Every street corner, every marketplace, every scandal was a scene unfolding. They didn't need permission to feel. They didn't need silence to think. They let life roar through them, unfiltered and unapologetic. It's tempting to believe we've grown past all that noise, that we've refined the chaos into something purer. But maybe we've just forgotten how to listen to it. The Elizabethans lived in a world that forced them to confront impermanence daily. Theirs was a theater built on the edge of death, and that's what made it so alive. They didn't watch stories to forget mortality. They watched to make peace with it. There's something deeply wise about that, and maybe a little terrifying too. Because when you stop pretending you'll live forever, everything suddenly matters. Every laugh, every mistake, every heartbeat becomes a scene worth remembering. And that, perhaps, is the greatest legacy of those filthy, divine playhouses by the Thames. They taught us that beauty doesn't hide from ugliness, it grows through it. That laughter doesn't cancel sorrow, it survives alongside it. That stories aren't there to protect us from reality, but to prepare us for it. The Elizabethans may have lived among disease and dirt, but they found a kind of grace that still escapes us, the ability to look at the world with all its pain and absurdity, and still stand up, still cheer, still say, encore. So the ghosts of those theaters remain, not to haunt us, but to remind us. Every time we sit in the dark, waiting for a story to begin, they're there. Muddy boots, ale-stained hands, eyes bright with mischief, whispering that life itself is the greatest play ever written. And the punchline, as always, is that no one ever really knows the ending. It's strange how the things we bury never really stay buried. The wooden planks of those old theaters have long rotted into the ground, but the laughter that once thundered through them still trembles somewhere in the air. London, for all its modern polish, still carries a hint of that mischief, that wild pulse that refuses to die. You can walk along the South Bank today and feel it like a vibration under your shoes, the echo of thousands of voices that once shouted, cheered, and cursed in the open air. It's as if the city itself never stopped performing, only changed its costume. The ghosts of the globe aren't solemn. They don't whisper in Latin or drag chains through corridors. They laugh. They laugh at us, at our seriousness, our obsession with cleanliness, our endless attempts to make life seem prettier than it is. They laugh because they know what we forget. That filth and beauty were never opposites, only dance partners. Back then, people didn't hide from the mud. They stood in it, sang in it, made art out of it. The smell of life was everywhere, and maybe that's why everything they touched felt more alive. It's ironic, isn't it? The further we get from dirt, the less we seem to feel. And maybe that's the quiet tragedy of modernity. We've traded texture for comfort. Those early theaters were full of danger. Not metaphorical danger, but actual, physical, you might die here danger. The planks could collapse, the crowd could riot, the plague could spread, or the roof could literally catch fire. And yet, people still went. Imagine having that kind of hunger. Today, half the audience won't go out if there's a 20% chance of rain. But back then, they stood for hours in the open air, shoulder to shoulder with strangers, watching a story unfold. Maybe they weren't brave because they had to be. Maybe they were brave because it was the only way to feel alive. It's fascinating how risk changes the way people love things. Those who risked the most to experience theater cherished it more deeply. The words hit harder, the laughter lasted longer. Life was a tightrope walk between disaster and ecstasy, and the stage reflected that perfectly. Shakespeare didn't write about tidy emotions. He wrote about jealousy that killed, ambition that consumed, love that devoured everything in its path. It wasn't exaggeration, it was reportage. The audience recognized themselves in that chaos, and they loved it because it was honest. No filters, no moral disclaimers, no apologies, just truth, in all its mud and magnificence. Sometimes I wonder if that's what we miss most. Not the stories, but the rawness, the freedom to feel something without fear of being judged for it. The Elizabethans weren't embarrassed by emotion. They wore it like perfume. Anger, lust, grief, it was all fair game. They didn't dissect feelings. They lived them. Today, we analyze emotions like scientists studying insects, pinning them to boards until they stop moving. But those people, they danced with their emotions, even when it hurt, especially when it hurt. And yet, amid that chaos, they found grace. There was something sacred about those gatherings, something almost defiant in their joy. The world around them was cruel. Disease, hunger, corruption. And still they chose laughter. Not the shallow kind, but the deep, rib-cracking kind that comes from knowing life is absurd. Humor was their survival mechanism. They laughed not because things were funny, but because if they didn't, they might collapse under the weight of it all. Maybe that's why so many of Shakespeare's darkest plays still sparkle with wit. Even in tragedy, there's always a fool on stage reminding us that despair and comedy share the same heartbeat. The theater, in a way, became their therapy, long before anyone thought to invent the word. It was where the poor man could see a king fall, and the nobleman could watch a fool speak the truth. Everyone walked away humbled, a little bruised, a little wiser. The stage was society's pressure valve, the one place where everyone for a few hours could admit how ridiculous and fragile they really were. And that might be the greatest miracle of all, that something born in filth could become a temple of honesty. But honesty is dangerous. The powerful have always feared it. And so the theater was attacked again and again, banned, censored, moralized into silence. Every age tries to kill what it can't control, yet somehow it always rises again. It's almost funny in a cosmic sense. You can silence a preacher, imprison a writer, burn a book, but you can't stop people from telling stories. It's built into the human operating system. We're addicted to narrative. We'd rather hear a lie that moves us than a truth that doesn't. The Elizabethans knew this instinctively. They didn't trust politicians or priests to tell them what was real. They trusted the stage. And maybe that's why their world still speaks to ours. We think we've advanced, but we're still standing in the same crowd, waiting for someone to step into the light and tell us a story worth believing. The difference is, our stages have changed shape from wooden platforms to glowing screens. We scroll where they stood, we binge watch where they shouted. But deep down, it's the same ritual. We still gather in the dark to witness the strange miracle of human imagination. We still cry for people who never existed. We still laugh at ourselves through the mouths of actors who don't even know our names. Sometimes, when you think about it, it's absurd. This idea that we, fragile and fleeting, spend our lives chasing illusions. But that's the paradox that makes us human. We build worlds out of words because the real one is never enough. And every time we do, the ghosts of those long dead playhouses smile. They understand that the performance never ended. It just changed venues. If you listen hard enough, you can almost hear their laughter beneath the hum of our machines. The same laughter that rose from muddy pits centuries ago. Laughter that mocked kings, comforted beggars, and dared to say that beauty could live in filth. It's still there, echoing through time, reminding us that the world has always been ridiculous and that maybe the only sane response is to applaud. And somewhere in that applause, whether it's the clap of hands, the click of a mouse, or the silent beating of a heart that finally feels something again, those ghosts take a bow. Because the show, as it turns out, never ended. It just kept finding new ways to begin. It's almost poetic how something built from wood, sweat, and chaos could leave a mark that even centuries can't wash away. The Elizabethan theaters were never meant to last forever. They were temporary by design, fragile like everything else in their world. But maybe that's what made them immortal. The very fact that they shouldn't have survived is exactly why they did. Each performance was an act of rebellion against oblivion. And in that rebellion, something extraordinary was born. A kind of defiant magic that still lingers in every laugh, every line, every moment of silence that falls before the applause. The strange part is they never thought of it as history. To them, it was life. Messy, fleeting, and loud. They weren't performing for the ages. They were performing for the next pint, the next meal, the next spark of joy in a world that rarely offered one. And yet, that's the secret of immortality, isn't it? The people who chase greatness almost never find it. The ones who stumble into it by accident, who just do what they love with everything they've got, they're the ones time can't erase. Shakespeare didn't write to be studied. He wrote to pay the rent. Maybe that's why his words still breathe, because they were never embalmed in the first place. But for all the glory that came later, those early days weren't romantic. They were rough, dangerous, and gloriously human. Actors were seen as outcasts, one step above beggars and one step below thieves. Women weren't even allowed on stage. Boys played the roles of queens and courtesans. And yet, despite all that, people came in droves. They came because the theater spoke the truth. Not the kind of truth you read in books or heard in church, but the kind that smelled like beer and heartbreak. It was the truth of being alive, the kind that makes you laugh even when it hurts. There's something timeless in that honesty. People back then didn't go to the theater to escape their problems. They went to face them, to see them dressed up and exaggerated until they made sense. They wanted to feel their own fears and desires reflected in the flicker of torchlight. And the plays gave them that, not moral lessons, but mirrors. Even now, when we sit in the dark of a cinema or scroll through a screen, we're still looking for the same thing, a reflection that makes us feel less alone. Maybe we've just traded wooden benches for leather seats and candlelight for pixels. It's funny how we still crave that connection, even when we pretend we don't. Modern life teaches us to be self-contained, independent, stoic. But the Elizabethans didn't buy that lie. They lived too close to death to take isolation seriously. When the plague hit, theaters closed, cities emptied, and yet, as soon as the danger passed, people flooded back to the stage. You can almost picture them. The same faces that buried their neighbors one week laughing at a bawdy joke the next. It wasn't denial, it was defiance. They laughed because death couldn't stand laughter. They understood that joy is not the absence of pain, but its only cure. The energy inside those theaters must have been electric. The crowds weren't polite. They didn't sit quietly in judgment. They roared, argued, flirted, and fought. If they liked you, they adored you. If they didn't, you'd know before your second line. And somehow, in that unpredictable chaos, the actors found rhythm. It was a dance between performer and audience, between chaos and control. Every night was different, every performance a negotiation between truth and improvisation. There was no guarantee of success, no safety net, and that's what made it thrilling. Sometimes I think that's what we've lost. The willingness to risk failure in pursuit of something real. The Elizabethans didn't rehearse perfection. They rehearsed humanity. They didn't need pristine sound systems or flawless lighting. They had raw emotion. And the audience didn't come for technical precision. They came for catharsis. They came to see themselves reflected in the madness on stage. We, on the other hand, have perfected distraction. We chase perfection so hard that we forget to feel. We edit our lives like we edit our photos, smoother, cleaner, emptier. But the theater back then had no filters. You got the real thing, sweat and all. And the irony is, that's exactly what made it sacred. The same dirt people tried to wash away was the very thing that gave life to their art. Those wooden planks were soaked with humanity. Its tears, its laughter, its spit, its sins. Maybe that's why we still talk about it, still romanticize it, still try to rebuild it. Deep down, we miss being that close to the truth. We miss the danger of it, the unpredictability, the smell of something alive instead of something polished. Art wasn't a product. It was a living, breathing argument with existence itself. What's remarkable is how much of that spirit still survives, even after centuries of refinement. Every time an actor steps on stage, they're doing what those Elizabethans did, standing in front of strangers and saying, "This is what it feels like to be human." It's a terrifying kind of honesty, one that requires you to strip away all the armor modern life makes you wear. But that's why people keep watching. Because for a moment the masks come off, and we see each other, truly see each other, in a way that everyday life doesn't allow. There's a certain humility in that exchange, too. In the theater, it doesn't matter who you are outside, rich, poor, famous, forgotten. Inside, you're just another heartbeat in the dark. The same rule applied in the Elizabethan pits. Everyone, from noble to beggar, was equal before the story. Maybe that's why people feared the theater. Because it had the power to level the world, to remind everyone that beneath the lace and the rags, we all laugh at the same jokes and we all fear the same ending. It's both terrifying and comforting, the idea that our differences dissolve under the light of a good story. And in that way, the theater became more than entertainment. It became a map of the human condition, one that stretched from the muddy floors of the globe to the screens in our pockets today. The names change, the costumes change, but the script remains the same. People trying to make sense of their own absurdity. That's the quiet, enduring legacy of those wild, smelly, magnificent playhouses. They taught us that life isn't about avoiding the dirt. It's about finding grace in it. Even now, when the curtain falls and the applause fades, there's a moment of silence that feels almost sacred. It's the same silence those Elizabethans must have felt, the breath between chaos and reflection, the reminder that for all our progress, for all our technology and comfort, we are still creatures who need stories to survive. Because stories don't just tell us who we were, they remind us who we are still becoming. And somewhere, deep beneath the polished streets of London, under the glass towers and subway tracks, the ghosts of the old theaters are still laughing, not out of mockery, but out of recognition. They've seen the truth we keep forgetting, that life will always be loud, dirty, unpredictable, and beautiful precisely because of it. There's something almost unfair about how time erases the smell, but not the sound. The stink of the Elizabethan theaters, that unforgettable perfume of sweat, beer, and decay, is gone, but the echoes of their laughter still cling to the world like a stubborn melody. You can't scrub that away. Maybe that's the truest kind of immortality, not statues or books or even fame, but noise. The sound of human chaos refusing to fade. And that's what those theaters were. Living symphonies of chaos. No conductor, no score, just thousands of people breathing, shouting, weeping, and laughing in unison, trying to remember what it felt like to be alive together. Sometimes I think about those crowds standing shoulder to shoulder, pressed so close that strangers could feel each other's hearts beating. They didn't come from privilege. They came from the streets, from the markets, from lives so hard that even a story felt like salvation. The theater gave them something the church couldn't: forgiveness without conditions. No sin was too ugly to laugh at, no sorrow too dark to share. In a world obsessed with purity, those wooden stages were gloriously impure. They were places where you could confess by laughing, cry without shame, and maybe, just maybe, walk away a little lighter. It's funny, isn't it? We like to think that progress has made us more civilized. We sit in soft seats, surrounded by silence, our emotions neatly folded inside like laundry. We clap politely instead of shouting, we whisper instead of howling, we even cry quietly, like grief should come with a volume setting. But the Elizabethans didn't edit themselves. Their joy was loud, their anger louder. They weren't ashamed of being human. They were ashamed of pretending not to be. There's something to envy in that kind of honesty. They didn't hide their madness behind etiquette. They wore it like jewelry. The actors fed on that energy. You can imagine them, faces painted with lead and sweat, voices cracking from exhaustion, giving everything they had to a crowd that could turn from laughter to rage in a heartbeat. There were no microphones, no safety nets, no second takes, only breath, timing, and courage. The audience was a living beast, and the actor had to tame it anew every night. When it worked, the connection was electric. Not polite applause, but something raw and primal, a shared heartbeat that turned strangers into witnesses. Maybe that's what we've lost, that delicious unpredictability, the danger of things going wrong. And we call it imperfection. They called it theater. And in that imperfection, they found truth. Real life is never tidy. It stumbles, it contradicts itself, it breaks down in laughter at funerals and finds poetry in filth. The Elizabethans didn't separate the sacred from the vulgar because they understood they came from the same root. That's why their plays still sting, because they never lied about how messy people are. Shakespeare could put kings and clowns in the same story and make them equals, because he knew that power doesn't make anyone cleaner, just better dressed. There's something deeply comforting about that realization, that even in the highest palaces, the human heart still misbehaves. You can almost see those wooden walls pulsing with life, every crack filled with secrets. People didn't just go to the theater to watch stories. They went to be seen. It was as much about spectacle off stage as on. Lovers flirted, thieves prowled, deals were struck, reputations made and ruined all in a single afternoon. The theater was society's mirror, but also its marketplace. The irony is delicious. The same nobles who condemned the theater as immoral couldn't resist sneaking in for the best seats. Hypocrisy, it seems, ages just as well as poetry. And yet, despite the filth, despite the danger, something transcendent happened there. When the lights, or rather the sunlight, hit the stage, the noise would fade for a heartbeat. The audience would hold its breath, and for that moment, the entire city would disappear. It didn't matter if you were a butcher or a baron. For those few minutes, everyone was inside the same dream. That's the part of theater that no history book can explain, the miracle of suspended disbelief, of people choosing to forget themselves together. It's not religion, not politics, not reason. It's something older, wilder, the primal need to believe in a story, even when you know it's not real. And maybe that's the secret we keep chasing. We build our worlds bigger, cleaner, smarter, but we still crave that flicker of shared illusion. That moment when the story becomes more real than the world outside. The Elizabethans had to fight for it, through mud, disease, and moral outrage, but they found it night after night. We have all the comfort they never did, yet we seem hungrier for meaning than they ever were. Maybe comfort dulls us. Maybe we need a bit of dirt to remember we're alive. There's a certain comedy in how history repeats itself. Every age thinks it's too sophisticated for the vulgar joy of the past, until it isn't. The Victorians tried to make theater respectable, and it nearly killed it. Modern audiences try to intellectualize it, and the same danger lurks. Art doesn't need to be respectable to matter, it just needs to be true. The Elizabethans got that instinctively. They didn't seek meaning. They created it by accident, out of noise and laughter and fear. Maybe that's why their art endures, while so much of ours fades the moment the credits roll. The funny thing is, for all their filth and ignorance, they understood something about connection that we, with all our technology, still struggle to grasp. They knew that meaning isn't something you find alone in silence. It's something born in the noise between people. Every laugh, every gasp, every shared glance across a crowded pit was proof of that. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and that made it eternal. So when the sun dipped low and the plays ended, the audience would spill back into the streets, drunk on words and beer, carrying pieces of the performance with them. The lines would echo through taverns, whispered in alleys, sung in the dark. That was how a story survived back then. Not written down, but passed from mouth to mouth, alive like rumor or prayer. And maybe that's what theater was always meant to be. Not a monument, but a contagion. Something that spreads, mutates, and refuses to die. Even now, when we sit in air-conditioned rooms staring at screens, that same spirit lingers. We laugh at the same absurdities, cry over the same betrayals, marvel at the same miracle of being human. The costumes change, the accents shift, but the story remains the same. We still gather, still wait for the lights to dim, still crave the chance to believe, even for a moment, that our own chaos has meaning. And somewhere, deep beneath the noise of our modern lives, the ghosts of those wooden theaters are still clapping, not out of nostalgia, but out of recognition. They know the truth we keep trying to forget, that as long as we can laugh together, cry together, and lose ourselves in the same story, the play will never truly end. It's almost impossible to imagine how much noise a wooden stage could hold, not just the literal clamor of voices, feet, and laughter, but the noise of life itself pressed into every splinter, every beam. Those theaters were like lungs, inhaling the city's chaos and exhaling art, the smell of roasted nuts mixed with sweat, the chatter of tradesmen beside lords, the faint scent of the Thames carrying both water and waste. It was disgusting and glorious at the same time, and yet out of that mess came something that no perfume of our age could ever replace: the scent of truth. Because truth, no matter how poetic, always smells a little human. If you could stand there among them, you'd feel the pulse of London beating beneath your feet. A city of contradictions. Plague and poetry, dirt and divinity, poverty and brilliance. The crowd wasn't an audience. It was an organism, breathing, laughing, coughing, sneezing, reacting to every word. A line that made them gasp one day could make them roar the next. The actors had to listen to them as much as they were listened to. The performance wasn't a monologue, it was a conversation, sometimes loving, sometimes cruel, but that's what made it alive. It's funny how something so chaotic could feel more real than the calm, scripted performances we now pay fortunes to see in silence. There's something deeply human about imperfection. The Elizabethans didn't have the luxury of pretense. Not in their streets, not in their lives, not in their theaters. The world was too fragile, too unpredictable to waste time pretending. Maybe that's why their stories hit harder. Every tragedy was an echo of reality, every comedy a rebellion against despair. The people in the crowd didn't need to imagine loss. They lived it. They didn't need to pretend they understood death. They buried their neighbors every other week. But still they laughed, because laughter was a kind of prayer, the only one that didn't require belief to work. And those actors, how could they not be saints of some kind? They faced a crowd that could love them one minute and pelt them with apples the next. Their voices carried without microphones, their faces painted with poison, their lives a gamble between fame and starvation. Yet they returned night after night, chasing that brief moment when words turned into magic. It wasn't about glory, it was about connection, about standing in the center of chaos and daring to make it beautiful, even if only for an hour. Perhaps that's why they were feared as much as adored. Because anyone who can make you feel that alive also makes you realize how dead you've been. Imagine the courage it took to do what they did, to pour your soul into a story knowing the world might forget it by morning, to speak truths so sharp they could cut in front of people who might not be ready to hear them. It's the same courage every artist still needs, though the danger now comes from indifference rather than rotten fruit. Silence has replaced the jeer, a quieter, deadlier kind of rejection. But even today, the best art still carries that Elizabethan defiance. You may not like this, but you will feel it. And in that challenge, something eternal survives. The beauty of those old theaters was that they belonged to everyone. The rich paid for the shade, the poor stood in the mud, but the story was shared equally. For a few hours, hierarchy dissolved. The beggar could laugh at a king, the noble could weep for a fool. In that space, the world turned upside down, and people remembered what it meant to be equals. Maybe that's the real reason theater scared the powerful, because it made the impossible seem natural. It showed people that class, like costume, could be taken off. There's an almost comic irony in how history repeats itself. We've built taller walls, fancier theaters, and shinier screens, but the hunger remains the same. We still chase that feeling of unity, of seeing ourselves reflected in someone else's chaos. We've just traded wooden benches for streaming platforms, the pit for the comment section. The difference is, they had no distance between them and the story. They could feel the spittle of an actor's monologue hit their skin. We, meanwhile, scroll through our emotions like a menu, too afraid to taste anything too real. And yet, every once in a while, a story breaks through, one that cracks our polished surfaces, one that smells faintly of sweat and earth, one that reminds us of what the Elizabethans knew by instinct, that beauty isn't sterile. It's born from contact, from friction, from life rubbing too close to the edge of death. The audience back then didn't need special effects. The thunder they heard was real, a storm rolling over the city. The tragedy they felt was personal, their own reflection shouting back at them from the stage. Maybe that's why their experience feels more honest. They didn't just watch stories, they lived them in real time. The city outside the theater was an extension of the performance. You could leave the play and walk into a street fight, a sermon, or a plague cart, and all of it felt like part of the same story. The line between art and reality was too thin to see, and maybe that was the point. Life didn't wait for an audience, and art didn't ask for permission. Both happened at once, messy and inseparable. That's what made the Elizabethan world so intoxicating. Everything was immediate. There was no curtain between the stage and the world, only breath. Even the language they used was alive. It was elastic, wild, playful. Words could mean three things at once, could make you laugh and wound you in the same sentence. The English tongue back then was still a creature learning to walk, and the theater taught it how to run. The actors twisted it, stretched it, invented it anew every night. We forget that what we now study as sacred literature was once street slang. Shakespeare didn't speak above his people, he spoke through them. His words survived because they weren't too pure to get dirty. And perhaps that's the final lesson hidden in all that noise and filth. Greatness doesn't come from distance, it comes from proximity, from being close enough to touch the world even when it stinks. The Elizabethans didn't rise above life, they dove into it head first. They didn't polish their art to make it respectable. They let it breathe unwashed and unapologetic. And because of that, their work still beats with the pulse of something real, something that refuses to die. So the next time you sit in a quiet theater or watch a film in the dark or feel a lump in your throat at a story you can't explain, remember those muddy, noisy crowds. Remember that once upon a time, art didn't happen to people. It happened with them. And maybe, beneath the scent of popcorn and polished floors, that same old magic is still there, waiting to be breathed back to life by someone brave enough to make a little noise, because that's what the Elizabethans left us. Not perfection, not purity, but the eternal permission to be gloriously, beautifully human. There's a kind of magic that only exists when something shouldn't work but somehow does. That was the secret of the Elizabethan theater. It was never supposed to be beautiful, yet it was. It was loud, smelly, crowded, chaotic, and completely alive. And maybe that's why it endured. Because deep down, humans have always loved things that are imperfect but honest. The globe, with its wooden beams and dirt floors, was never just a building. It was a beating heart. And like all hearts, it pulsed to the rhythm of laughter, fear, and desire. If you could walk through it, really walk through it, you'd realize it wasn't the stage that mattered. It was the people. The vendors shouting about pies that would probably poison you. The sailors shouting drunken insults at the actors. The lovers in the shadows whispering things they'd deny in daylight. Every soul that entered the theater carried a piece of the city inside them, and when they gathered, London itself seemed to breathe. The plays didn't just reflect society, they were society. Messy, vibrant, unfiltered. It's strange how something so rooted in noise and imperfection could speak so clearly about what it means to be human. The actors, those strange alchemists of emotion, were the bridge between chaos and creation. They weren't revered the way we revere stars today. They were half adored, half despised, a mixture of celebrity and sin. They lived on the edge of respectability, sleeping in taverns, dodging creditors, and sometimes being chased out of town. And yet, they were the keepers of something sacred. With nothing but their voices and their courage, they made the impossible real. One moment they were beggars, the next they were kings. Maybe that's the quiet joke at the center of theater. We spend our lives pretending not to be actors, while they make a living admitting that they are. What's fascinating is how much the world has changed while the need for illusion has stayed the same. Today we have screens instead of stages, influencers instead of jesters, digital applause instead of clapping hands. But the hunger behind it is identical. The desire to be seen, to feel something that isn't numb, to believe, even for a heartbeat, that our stories matter. The Elizabethans didn't have algorithms, but they had instinct. They knew what would make people lean forward, laugh, or cry. They knew that truth dressed as fiction could pierce deeper than any sermon. And in a world as cruel and uncertain as theirs, a good story wasn't a luxury, it was survival. It's almost comical how history repeats itself. People once worried that plays were corrupting the youth, filling their heads with dangerous ideas. Today, we say the same thing about social media, movies, or video games. But the real danger has never been stories. It's forgetting how to tell them. The Elizabethans understood that. They didn't just consume their entertainment, they participated in it. The audience shouted advice to the actors, laughed at the wrong moments, and sometimes stormed the stage if the story hit too close to home. It was messy, unpredictable, and gloriously real. Art wasn't something distant and refined. It was something you could reach out and touch, and sometimes get slapped for touching too hard. And in that chaos, something extraordinary happened. Empathy. For a few hours, people forgot their hunger, their debts, their diseases. They became someone else. A thief could weep for a queen. A nobleman could laugh at a fool. The boundaries that ruled their lives outside dissolved in the dark. Maybe that's why those theaters were so dangerous to authority. Because they reminded people that humanity doesn't fit neatly into categories. Everyone bleeds, everyone laughs, everyone loves, and everyone dies. It's an inconvenient truth, but theater made it impossible to ignore. The funniest part is that the people who built those theaters probably had no idea they were creating something eternal. They were just businessmen chasing profit, carpenters hammering together wood, actors trying not to starve. But that's how great things often start. Not with vision, but with desperation. Nobody sets out to make history, they just try to make rent. And yet, those accidental acts of creation outlive everything else. There's something humbling about that, something beautifully ironic. The monuments built to last crumble, but the stories whispered to survive endure. And the language? Oh, the language. The Elizabethans treated English like clay, molding it into shapes it had never taken before. They invented words when the ones they had weren't enough, twisted grammar until it danced, and filled their lines with metaphors so sharp they still cut today. They didn't care about rules, they cared about rhythm, about how a sentence felt in the mouth and sounded in the ear. That's why their plays still feel modern, because they speak in the heartbeat of emotion, not the accent of their century. When you strip away the lace and the ruffles, you find that they were talking about the same things we are: power, jealousy, love, betrayal, the need to be remembered. The costumes changed, but the soul stayed the same. There's a strange kind of wisdom in how they lived with contradiction. Their world was full of plague and filth, yet they wrote about beauty. They lived under censorship and tyranny, yet they mocked kings in plain sight. They knew that laughter was the one rebellion no tyrant could suppress. And maybe that's the most enduring lesson of all. When life stinks, make a joke. When the world feels unbearable, turn it into a play. They face death every day, but they refuse to let fear write their final act. That's not denial. That's courage disguised as comedy. Sometimes I wonder if that's why their stories still haunt us. Because deep down, we're still those same creatures, afraid, hopeful, ridiculous, magnificent. We still crave laughter when things fall apart, still seek meaning in the middle of chaos, still look for someone brave enough to speak the words we can't. The Elizabethans gave us a language for that, a wild, imperfect, beautiful language that refuses to die. And every time someone steps on a stage, or a screen lights up, or a voice tells a story in the dark, that old magic wakes up again. It's comforting to think that, after all this time, we're not so different from the groundlings packed into the globe, shouting and sweating and believing in the impossible. We're still trying to make sense of our own mess, still pretending we're more civilized than we really are. And maybe that's the secret the ghosts of those theaters are still trying to tell us, that the performance never ended. We're all actors, still stumbling through our lines, still searching for applause, still hoping that, in the end, the story we've told was worth the noise. There's a strange kind of eternity that hides in things we never meant to last. The Elizabethan playhouses were built from cheap timber and ambition, fragile, temporary, and utterly defiant. They weren't designed for history, they were designed for the moment. Yet somehow, those moments refused to die. They survived every fire, every plague, every Puritan sermon screaming about sin, until eventually the wood itself turned to legend. Maybe that's the secret of endurance. Not permanence, but presence. To live so vividly in one instant that even centuries can't forget you. What made those theaters unforgettable wasn't just the plays. It was the collision between the sacred and the ridiculous, the noble and the obscene. They had no walls to separate the divine from the profane, because life didn't separate them either. You could watch Hamlet at noon and step outside to see a public hanging by 1 o'clock. The same hands that clapped for tragedy threw rotten vegetables at thieves an hour later. Morality back then wasn't about purity. It was about surviving the day with your soul half intact. The people didn't hide from darkness. They lived in it, laughed in it, even made art from it. Perhaps that's why their stories still work. They never pretend life is neat. The audience, too, was part of the play. No one sat politely, waiting to applaud at the end. They yelled, they wept, they interrupted. They bargained with the actors like it was a street performance, because in many ways it was. They came from all corners of society, from beggars to barons, crammed together in that open pit where everyone stank the same. There was something almost democratic about that chaos. For a few hours, hierarchy dissolved into sweat and laughter. No crown or title could protect you from a good punchline. If the king looked ridiculous, the crowd howled. If the fool spoke truth, they listened. The theater gave them what no law or sermon could: equality, even if it lasted only until the curtain fell. The performers fed on that electricity. They were the first real celebrities, adored, mocked, envied, and feared. Yet their fame was always fleeting. One bad performance could ruin you. One well-aimed piece of fruit could humble even the proudest star. It's almost poetic that the greatest actor of the age could still get booed by a butcher. The theater was democracy at its most brutal. But in that merciless arena, brilliance was forged. Actors learned to survive not by perfection, but by adaptability. They had to sense the crowd like a sailor senses the sea. Every wave of laughter, every gust of silence mattered. In a way, they weren't just performing plays. They were conducting human emotion in real time. And those words they spoke, heavy, rhythmic, alive, weren't just lines on a page. They were spells. The playwrights knew exactly what they were doing. They used language like music, twisting it until it danced, stabbing it until it hurt. The words weren't meant to be read quietly. They were meant to explode out of mouths and into hearts. The Elizabethans invented entire worlds with sentences that shouldn't have worked, but somehow did. They broke grammar the way artists break rules, not out of ignorance, but out of hunger. They were trying to describe things that hadn't been named yet: desire, betrayal, madness, wonder. When you think about it, they weren't just performing plays. They were teaching a young language how to dream. It's funny to imagine how little they knew of what they were creating. None of them could have guessed that centuries later, people would sit in quiet classrooms dissecting their work like sacred scripture. If you told an Elizabethan groundling that future scholars would debate whether Hamlet was truly mad, he'd probably laugh and ask if the ale had gone bad. They weren't looking for philosophy. They were looking for reflection, for a story that told the truth without sermonizing, that showed how ridiculous, how terrifying, how fragile life really was. Maybe that's why the laughter mattered as much as the tragedy. Comedy wasn't an escape from pain, it was proof that pain hadn't won. There's something deeply human in that balance, the refusal to separate joy from sorrow. The Elizabethans knew that one couldn't exist without the other. Even their dirtiest jokes carried wisdom, and their most poetic lines hid filth. They didn't see contradiction as hypocrisy. They saw it as truth, because people aren't pure. We're messy, contradictory, ridiculous creatures who can fall in love during a funeral or crack a joke in the middle of a crisis. The Elizabethans didn't run from that chaos, and they celebrated it. Maybe that's why modern audiences still find themselves in those ancient words. They remind us that confusion isn't a flaw in being human, it's the point of it. It's tempting to romanticize all this, to imagine the past as a golden age of passion and authenticity. But the truth is, those people were terrified most of the time. Death lurked around every corner. Disease, hunger, superstition. Life was a gamble, and the house always won. The theater wasn't a luxury, it was medicine. It gave people a way to laugh at the very thing that haunted them, and that's the quiet miracle of art. It turns fear into something bearable, even beautiful. The Elizabethans didn't need psychologists or self-help books. They had stories. They had laughter. They had a wooden stage that told them, in a language older than reason, you're not alone in this madness. And perhaps that's why their legacy feels so alive. It isn't because of preservation or scholarship. It's because they captured something timeless, that hunger to feel connected in a world built on isolation. We still chase that same feeling today. We still gather in the dark to watch strangers pretend to be us, to live and die and love on our behalf. We still crave the illusion that, for a little while, everything makes sense. The only difference is that our stages now glow with electricity instead of candlelight. But the spell is the same. The need is the same. The ache for meaning has never left us. When the last torch went out and the play was done, the Elizabethan crowd stumbled back into the filthy streets, their laughter fading into the night. They went home to cold rooms and hard beds, carrying with them pieces of stories that would outlive them all. They didn't know they were part of something eternal. They didn't have to. Eternity doesn't need to be understood, only lived. And that's what they did, night after night, until history turned their mud and madness into myth. So the next time you read one of those lines that seems too perfect to have been written by a mortal, remember where it came from. Not from ivory towers or royal courts, but from a world that smelled of sweat and smoke, from people who didn't have the luxury of pretending that life was clean. They made beauty out of their own mess, art out of their own mortality. And maybe that's the truest kind of art there is. Not the kind that lasts forever, but the kind that burns so brightly in the moment that forever has no choice but to remember it. If you could step into London during the height of the Elizabethan age, you wouldn't just hear it, you'd feel it. The city hummed like a living thing, pulsing with trade, gossip, and the stink of humanity. Horses clattered down narrow lanes, slick with rain and waste. Bells rang out from churches, mingling with the cries of vendors selling eels, ink, or indulgences. But louder than all of it, louder even than the curses and laughter spilling from the taverns, was the sound of the theater. It wasn't refined or quiet. It was a roar, the kind that comes when thousands of people forget their misery long enough to feel joy together. Theaters, then, were the great equalizers of London. They didn't care if you were a beggar, a butcher, or a duke. Once you walked through the gates, the mud on your boots was as good as velvet. Everyone breathed the same foul air and laughed at the same jokes. It must have been liberating to live in a world where the Queen herself could commission a play about love and betrayal, while the same lines were being shouted to crowds of drunk apprentices by the Thames. Art belonged to everyone, not because it was cheap, but because it was alive. You couldn't contain it. You couldn't make it behave. And maybe that's why it lasted. There's something beautifully ironic about how the messiest art often ends up being the most immortal. The playwrights of that age didn't sit around imagining their words being quoted by scholars in quiet libraries. They were hustlers, not prophets. They wrote fast, revised rarely, and recycled shamelessly. Shakespeare himself borrowed half his plots, stole old legends, and reworked forgotten stories from Italy and Greece. But that's the brilliance of it. He didn't hide the theft, he transformed it. Every stolen tale came out sounding brand new because he filled it with life that was unmistakably human. Maybe that's the difference between genius and plagiarism. A plagiarist copies words, a genius steals truth. And the truth he captured wasn't pretty. Those plays were full of mud, murder, lust, and laughter, because so was the world. There's a temptation today to look back at the Elizabethans and think of them as quaint or primitive, but they were brutally honest about themselves. They didn't dress their sins in politeness. They displayed them in public, charged admission, and called it a matinee. Their theater was therapy before the word existed, a safe place to stare at the worst parts of being human and laugh instead of scream. That's what makes their stories timeless. They weren't pretending to be wise. They were just brave enough to be honest. It's easy to forget how much courage that required. To write or perform back then wasn't glamorous. It was dangerous. The wrong line could get you arrested. The wrong joke could get you whipped, exiled, or worse. Plays were censored by men who feared laughter more than rebellion because they knew laughter could do both. It could topple authority faster than any sword. The theater was where the powerless learned to speak, even if only through metaphor. A fool could mock a king, a peasant could question God, and everyone pretended it was just entertainment. But deep down, they knew what they were doing, turning satire into survival. And the people came, not despite the danger, but because of it. There's a thrill in watching someone say the things you're too afraid to admit. That's why the groundlings packed the globe, why the nobles watched from their boxes, why the city couldn't get enough of the stage. They wanted to see their world exaggerated, dissected, turned upside down. It wasn't about escapism. It was about recognition. They wanted to hear their own fears shouted in verse, their desires dressed in poetry. The plays told them they weren't alone in their madness. And maybe that's what keeps us coming back to them centuries later, that sense of being seen, even by ghosts. What's fascinating is how the same stories still work on us, even when we've changed everything else. The costumes are gone, the torches replaced by lights, the language modernized, but the emotions are identical. A jealous lover in 1600 isn't any different from a jealous lover today, just louder and probably smellier. Power still corrupts, love still saves and destroys. Humanity still finds new ways to make the same old mistakes. It's comforting, in a dark way, to realize that we haven't evolved as much as we pretend. The Elizabethans would probably find us hilarious, scrolling endlessly on our glowing rectangles, chasing dopamine the way they chased ale. But for all our progress, we envy them. They had something we've nearly forgotten: presence. No distractions, no filters, no screens between them and the story. When they watched a play, they lived it. Every gasp, every cheer, every tear was real. There was no content, no pause button, no algorithm deciding what came next. Only raw, unpredictable humanity. Maybe that's why their laughter echoes louder than ours, because it came from somewhere deeper. They laughed with their whole bodies, cried with their whole hearts. They weren't spectators. They were participants, and the stories rewarded that participation. They didn't just end, they lingered. The characters followed you home, whispering lines into your mind as you walked through the fog. You'd catch yourself quoting them without realizing, carrying fragments of their madness into your own life. The theater was contagious that way. It infected people with empathy. And isn't that the point of all art? To make you feel something, to make you remember that you still can? The Elizabethans didn't have the word empathy, but they practiced it every time they gathered under that thatched roof, laughing together at their own absurdity. What's strange is how that same spirit still flickers through us. We've traded wooden stages for digital screens, but the craving hasn't changed. We still look for meaning in chaos, still find beauty in imperfection, still hunger for stories that make us forget ourselves. The difference is, we've grown quieter about it. We hide our awe behind irony, our wonder behind analysis. Maybe that's why the old plays still feel so alive, because they remind us how to feel loudly again, how to be foolish enough to care. In the end, that might be the theater's greatest gift. It doesn't just tell us stories, it holds a mirror up to our noise and dares us to look. It reminds us that we've always been the same, flawed, funny, frightened, and magnificent in our contradictions. The Elizabethans knew it. They didn't sanitize life, they celebrated it. They turned pain into poetry and filth into laughter, and somehow it made them immortal. Perhaps that's why even now, if you stand by the Thames at dusk and listen closely, you can almost hear it, the echo of applause that never really stopped. It's easy to romanticize the past when you're standing far enough away from its smell. The Elizabethan age, from a distance, glows golden. All lace collars and eloquent monologues, poetry flowing like wine, actors performing under the open sky. But if you could step closer, the illusion would wrinkle. The streets stank of waste, rats ruled the gutters, and most people couldn't spell their own names, let alone quote Shakespeare. Yet in the middle of that mess, art bloomed like a weed through stone. It didn't need permission or polish. It needed only hunger. And that the Elizabethans had in abundance. London itself was the greatest character in the story. It was a city always on the edge of fever, growing too fast, too loud, too proud. People poured in from the countryside, from France, from Flanders, chasing fortune or fleeing disaster. The result was chaos, and chaos, as it turns out, is a perfect breeding ground for creativity. The noise of markets, the shouts of vendors, the clang of blacksmiths, the songs of beggars, all of it wove into the background music of the theater. You could almost hear the rhythm of daily life in every line of those plays. Maybe that's why they still feel alive. They were written in a city that never stopped talking. And talk they did. Londoners loved gossip more than gold. News spread faster than the plague, which, to be fair, spread pretty fast. People craved stories the way modern people crave notifications. If something scandalous happened in a palace or a brothel, and often both, it was guaranteed to end up on a stage within weeks. Playwrights were the original social media influencers, only with better insults. They mocked politicians, priests, and lovers alike, and everyone kept coming back for more. It was risky, sure, but risk was part of the fun. When words could get you hanged, saying them out loud was an act of rebellion. And nothing sells tickets like rebellion. The crowds were wild, unpredictable, and brutally honest. If they liked you, they cheered until your ears rang. If they didn't, they'd boo you off stage or hit you with the Elizabethan version of a bad review, whatever they had in their hands. You couldn't fake talent in front of an audience that drank more ale than water. It kept the actors sharp, alive, aware of every heartbeat in the crowd. They had to read the room before the term existed. Every sigh, every laugh, every cough told them how the story was landing. Maybe that's why theater then felt like lightning, unrepeatable, raw, and dangerously human. It's funny how much of that energy has disappeared. Today, audiences sit in velvet seats and whisper apologies if they sneeze. But imagine being in a theater where people shouted advice to the hero, where they wept openly and laughed without shame, where they were part of the performance. It wasn't breaking the fourth wall. The wall never existed. Everyone was in on the same secret, that pretending could reveal more truth than reality ever dared to. Maybe that's why it worked. The theater didn't separate itself from the world, it absorbed it. And in the middle of that storm stood the playwrights. Poets, hustlers, philosophers, and troublemakers rolled into one. They were half artists, half survivalists. A bad week meant no food. A bad review could mean no head. Yet they wrote anyway, scribbling words that would outlast kings. Shakespeare wasn't an exception, he was a symptom. Dozens of writers crowded those streets, competing, stealing, inspiring each other. Christopher Marlowe, for example, was rumored to be a spy, an atheist, and a genius, which in Elizabethan England was basically a death wish with style. He died young in a tavern brawl, stabbed in the eye over an unpaid bill, and somehow even his death felt like theater. That's the irony of it all. Like, they lived in fear, but they wrote about freedom. Their plays asked the questions no priest or politician dared to. What makes a man good? What makes a ruler just? What makes love worth the pain? These were dangerous questions, and yet they were disguised in laughter, hidden behind costumes and wordplay. Maybe that's the trick of art. It sneaks truth into people who would never swallow it otherwise. The audience thought they were being entertained, but they were being educated in empathy. It's quite the con, when you think about it. And for all their filth and cynicism, the Elizabethans were astonishingly hopeful. Their plays didn't pretend the world was fair, but they believed it could be beautiful. Even their tragedies shimmered with life. Death on stage wasn't just an ending, it was a mirror held up to existence. To die dramatically was to prove that life, for all its cruelty, meant something. It's a lesson we keep forgetting. We hide our pain, polish our flaws, and call it progress. But the Elizabethans wore their suffering like a badge. They cried loudly, loved recklessly, lived shamelessly. Maybe that's why their words still sting. They dared to feel everything, even the things we're too careful to name. And yet, it wasn't all nobility and depth. There was plenty of absurdity, too. These were people who thought bear baiting was an acceptable afternoon activity, who believed bathing was optional and astrology was science. It's almost comforting to know that humanity has always been ridiculous. You can dress it in ruffs or Wi-Fi, but the same foolish heart beats beneath it. Maybe that's why laughter was such a constant in their world, because it was the only defense against the madness of living. They laughed at death, at kings, at themselves. In a sense, that laughter is the truest sound of survival. What's most fascinating is how those wooden theaters became cathedrals of contradiction. They were built on the edge of morality, literally outside the city walls among taverns and brothels, yet they produced the purest expressions of human spirit. The church called them dens of sin. The people called them home. Maybe that's the paradox of all great art. It's born from the very thing society tries hardest to suppress. You can ban laughter, outlaw passion, censor truth, but they'll always find a stage. And when you think about it, maybe that's what we've inherited from them. Not just their language or their plays, but their defiance. Their belief that storytelling isn't a luxury, it's a necessity. We still build stages, just in different forms, screens, podcasts, stories told into the void of the internet, but the impulse is the same. We're still shouting into the darkness, hoping someone out there understands. That's what the Elizabethans were doing too, only with more fleas. In the end, their legacy isn't about Shakespeare or the Globe or any single play. It's about the audacity of it all. The idea that in a filthy, dying city, people still gathered to listen, to feel, to be reminded that they were alive. And that's the quiet miracle that echoes through time, that art doesn't need perfection, only participation. It survives because we keep showing up, because even now, centuries later, we still want what they wanted. to laugh, to cry, to believe that our tiny lives matter in a story much bigger than ourselves. And if that isn't theater, nothing ever was. If you stood in the heart of Elizabethan London long enough, you'd realize that the city itself was the greatest play ever written, and no one knew their lines. It was a place where elegance and filth held hands, where poetry lived in the same breath as profanity. The air reeked of smoke and ambition. The streets were alive with beggars and ballads, and somewhere between the bells and the cries, the first true sound of popular art began to echo. The theater wasn't built apart from this chaos. It was the chaos turned into music. And maybe that's why it worked, and because art never thrives in silence. It needs noise. There was something about those open-air playhouses that made them feel less like buildings and more like living creatures. They breathed with the crowd, creaked with laughter, sweated with tension. You could hear the wind whistle through the wooden rafters, smell the river in the distance, feel the pulse of the city just beyond the walls. Everything was alive. The actors, the audience, even the rats underfoot, waiting for the crumbs of applause. It's hard to imagine now, when we sit in climate-controlled rooms, staring at screens, that stories were once an act of survival. They weren't consumed, they were shared. What fascinates most about those audiences is that they weren't patient. They didn't come to the theater to appreciate art. They came to be moved or provoked. They wanted to laugh at the pompous, weep for the doomed, cheer for the clever. They wanted to shout advice to the characters and curse the villains out loud. And they did. The actors had to be part performers, part gladiators, reading the mood of 1,000 strangers who could love them one second and jeer them the next. The energy was unpredictable, dangerous even. The kind of collective madness that modern performances rarely achieve. It wasn't theater as entertainment, it was theater as riot. And yet, amid all that noise, something sacred happened. Words that should have been lost to the wind took root in memory. Sentences written by candlelight in cramped rooms found homes in people's mouths. Imagine being a fishmonger quoting Macbeth between sails, or a washerwoman whispering Romeo and Juliet to herself on the way home. The plays weren't just events, they became part of the bloodstream of the city. People didn't just attend them, they carried them away piece by piece, turning them into folklore. There's a reason some lines from those centuries still slip into our daily speech. They were written to be lived, not studied. But the theater was more than art. It was gossip, philosophy, and therapy rolled into one. If you couldn't afford confession, you went to a play. If you wanted to see your neighbor mocked in public, you went to a play. And if you wanted to understand what the world was turning into, you went to a play. The playwrights were the journalists of their time, only better dressed and slightly less reliable. They chronicled corruption, love, ambition, and stupidity with the precision of surgeons and the humor of thieves. And the best part? Everyone knew it. People watched the plays not to escape reality, but to recognize it. It's impossible to talk about that world without mentioning how fragile it was. One spark, literal or political, could destroy everything. The globe burned down during a performance because someone thought gunpowder would make a great special effect. The authorities shut the theaters whenever plague spread, which, in London, was basically every other summer. The actors lived in constant uncertainty, building stages knowing they might be torn down tomorrow. And yet they kept creating. That's the beauty of desperation. It makes artists fearless. When the world might end any week, you stop worrying about perfection. You just tell the story. Maybe that's what made their art so powerful. It wasn't about posterity. It was about immediacy. No one wrote for the future. They wrote for today. And somehow that urgency became timeless. There's something poetic about that irony, that the work born from the fear of being forgotten is the very thing that refused to die. Those playwrights didn't have the luxury of thinking about legacy. They just needed to fill the seats, feed the company, and stay out of jail. Yet, hundreds of years later, we quote their words as if they were gospel. It's almost comical. The idea that something so chaotic, so improvised, could become immortal. But maybe immortality is just what happens when honesty is performed loudly enough. The humor in it all is that the people who despised the theater the most helped it survive. The Puritans called it immoral, dangerous, even satanic. And they were right, just not in the way they meant. The theater was dangerous because it made people think, feel, and question. It made them laugh at power, sympathize with weakness, and imagine a world that could be different. That kind of danger can't be contained forever. The more it was condemned, the more irresistible it became. After all, nothing attracts a crowd like a forbidden joy. And joy, for the Elizabethans, was never simple. They didn't believe in pure happiness any more than they believed in pure tragedy. Life was always both, tangled together in a knot that no sermon could untie. That's why their plays could make you laugh during a funeral or cry during a wedding. It wasn't sentimentality, it was accuracy. The Elizabethans knew that life didn't come in clean genres. It came in chaos, and theater was the only art honest enough to admit it. If you think about it, we're not much different. We've just hidden our chaos better. We've learned to whisper where they shouted, to scroll where they sang. But deep down, the same pulse runs through us, and that craving for connection, for reflection, for something that cuts through the noise and makes us feel less alone. Every time we sit in a dark room and watch a story unfold, we're still part of their legacy. The stage might look different now, but the hunger hasn't changed. And maybe that's the real secret of why those words, those stories, those ragged theaters still haunt us. They remind us that art isn't meant to be clean. It's meant to be alive. That beauty doesn't live in perfection, but in the crack between laughter and grief. That the things we call timeless were never chasing eternity. They were just trying to make sense of their own fleeting moment. And in doing so, they spoke to every fleeting moment that came after. If you ever walk along the Thames at sunset, when the light turns gold and the city hums beneath it, imagine for a second that you can still hear them. The cheers, the cries, the pounding of feet against wooden floors. That's not nostalgia, that's inheritance. The ghosts of the globe are still there, whispering through the wind, reminding us that stories never die as long as someone keeps listening. And in that moment, as the river glows and the noise of modern life fades, you can almost hear the laughter that started it all. The laughter that refused to be silenced. The laughter that somehow outlasted time itself. There's something strangely modern about the Elizabethan theater, not in its appearance, of course, but in its soul. It was chaotic, loud, unfiltered, and dangerously democratic. It gave everyone a voice, whether they could read or not. It was the internet before electricity, a living network of rumor, laughter, and revelation. Every performance was a conversation between the stage and the streets, and like most good conversations, it could turn from laughter to outrage in a heartbeat. The actors weren't gods, they were mirrors, and if you didn't like what you saw, well, that was sort of the point. Imagine the scene. The play begins, the drums echo like distant thunder, and within minutes, you've got 1,000 people crammed together, sweating, shouting, drinking, reacting to every word. No air conditioning, no polite clapping, just raw human electricity. Someone spills ale on your boots, someone else starts arguing about whether the ghost in Hamlet was real, and all the while the actors fight to hold your attention against the roaring tide of London noise. It wasn't quiet reverence. It was combat. The kind of performance that could make you forget you were poor or sick or heartbroken, at least until the final line. It's easy to think of those audiences as unsophisticated, but they were sharper than we give them credit for. They didn't need professors to explain the symbolism. They felt it. When a king was mocked on stage, they knew exactly which real-life nobleman was being ridiculed. When a jester spoke truth disguised as nonsense, they laughed not just because it was funny, but because it was dangerous. The theater gave them what no sermon or proclamation could, the thrill of understanding the world's hypocrisy without being punished for it. A few pennies bought you not just entertainment, but liberation. What's remarkable is how often those audiences faced death outside the playhouse. The same people laughing at Falstaff one afternoon might be burying a family member by the weekend. The plague had a way of rewriting everyone's schedules. Yet somehow, the theaters always came back. The wooden doors reopened, the trumpet sounded again, and the people returned, hungry for laughter even as the world burned around them. It's a kind of madness, or maybe faith. Because what else but faith makes people gather in crowds during an epidemic, not to pray, but to laugh at the absurdity of being alive? And absurdity was everywhere. London in those days was a city where the divine and the disgusting existed shoulder to shoulder. You could walk from a cathedral to a brothel in less than 5 minutes. And many did. Theaters were often built in the same districts as bear-baiting pits and taverns, and the scent of blood and beer sometimes mixed with the perfume of the stage. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real. The audience might cheer for King Lear 1 hour and then watch dogs tear a chained bear apart the next. There's something both horrifying and honest about that contrast. It's civilization and savagery coexisting, which, come to think of it, is still the world we live in. We've just swapped the bear for the algorithm. The actors thrived in that chaos. They were craftsmen of emotion, manipulating crowds with a flick of tone or a well-timed pause. They didn't have microphones or spotlights, just lungs and instincts. Every gesture mattered. Every misstep could cost them their dignity or their livelihood. The applause was addictive but fleeting. You could be a hero on Tuesday and forgotten by Friday. And yet, they kept stepping on that stage, risking everything for that fleeting high. The sound of strangers believing, if only for a moment, that what you said mattered. If that doesn't sound familiar, you've probably never posted anything online. The playwrights, meanwhile, were wrestling with the impossible. They had to please both the illiterate and the elite, make jokes for fishmongers and philosophy for scholars, sometimes in the same sentence. The magic of it is that they managed to do both without losing anyone. Shakespeare could make a pun about sex and death that made a peasant howl with laughter, while a noble quietly nodded in existential despair. It was art that refused to choose a side. It said, "You're all ridiculous, and I love you for it." Maybe that's why those plays still work today. They make fools of everyone equally. But behind the laughter and applause, there was always danger. The government watched the theaters closely. knowing that stories could stir rebellion faster than any preacher. Words were weapons, sharper than swords, harder to confiscate. Playwrights learned to hide their critiques in metaphor, to aim their satire like an arrow wrapped in velvet. You could call a tyrant Caesar, and everyone knew who you meant. It's funny how censorship never really kills art, it just forces it to get cleverer. If anything, those restrictions made the plays deeper, layered with double meanings like secret maps. You could laugh in public while understanding something entirely different in private, a quiet rebellion disguised as entertainment. And as the city evolved, so did its art. The wooden theaters became cultural monuments, symbols of a world that refused to be tamed. Even after the Puritans shut them down, calling them dens of sin, their spirit seeped into taverns, drawing rooms, and streets. People found new ways to perform: music, storytelling, shadow plays. You can outlaw the building, but you can't outlaw the need. Every generation rediscovers it in a new form. The Elizabethans had stages, we have screens. The medium changes, but the craving stays the same. The hunger to see ourselves exaggerated, to laugh at our own disasters, to remember that we are not alone in our absurdity. Maybe that's what those old playhouses were really teaching, beneath all the noise and nonsense, that laughter is the most revolutionary act of all. To laugh in the face of disease, oppression, or poverty, that's defiance. It's a reminder that even when the world collapses, humanity keeps its punchline. And maybe that's what made the Elizabethans immortal. They didn't conquer death or chaos. They learned how to perform in spite of it. If you listen carefully, you can still hear that defiance echoing through the centuries. Not in the words, necessarily, but in the rhythm. The pulse of people coming together to feel something real. The same pulse you hear when strangers laugh in a dark theater, or when a story on a screen makes someone gasp out loud. It's the sound of life refusing to go quietly. The Elizabethans would have understood that perfectly. After all, they built their theaters not as monuments, but as proof. Proof that in a filthy, fragile world, art could still roar louder than death. And perhaps that's the only legacy worth leaving. If there was ever a time when life and theater were indistinguishable, it was the Elizabethan age. The line between performer and spectator barely existed. The world itself was a stage, and everyone played a part, whether they meant to or not. The butcher quoting poetry, the priest sneaking into a show, the queen commissioning plays about love while waging wars, all of it blurred together in a magnificent chaos. London wasn't just a city, it was a living performance. And the audience? They weren't just watching history unfold, they were the history. You can almost picture it. The River Thames gleaming under the morning fog, boats ferrying people to the theaters like arteries feeding a hungry heart. The Globe's flags waving high, signaling that a new play was about to begin. Tragedy if black, comedy if white, and history if red. Crowds flooded in, from nobles wrapped in silk to thieves still smelling of last night's trouble. They gathered shoulder to shoulder, the scent of sweat and excitement filling the air. And as soon as the trumpet sounded, the noise of London itself seemed to hush, if only for a heartbeat. Because something magical was about to happen. Not just words, but transformation. It's funny, really, how primitive and modern collided in those wooden arenas. No electricity, no microphones, not even a roof to protect against the rain. Yet, somehow those stages managed to generate more energy than any stadium today. The actors didn't need special effects. They were the special effects. With nothing but voice, gesture, and sheer nerve, they could make you believe in ghosts, kings, or fools who spoke like prophets. And the audience, wild and unfiltered, met them halfway. If the story soared, they cheered until their throats burned. If it faltered, they threw whatever they had on hand, fruit, insults, or worse. It was democracy at its most dangerous and exhilarating form. There's a certain beauty in how imperfect it all was. The costumes reused until they smelled like history. The wooden boards patched and splintered from countless performances. The candles dripping wax like tiny sacrifices to the gods of drama. Nothing was pristine, and yet everything was alive. Maybe that's what modern storytelling has lost. The permission to be messy. We've traded unpredictability for precision, emotion for polish. But in that glorious Elizabethan mess, every mistake could become magic. An actor forgetting a line, a bird flying across the stage, a sudden downpour interrupting a monologue. It all became part of the story. Life itself was improvising, and perhaps that's why their art feels immortal. Because it wasn't pretending to be perfect. It was pretending to be human. Every play was a reflection, distorted yet true, of the people watching it. Their loves, their fears, their foolishness. Shakespeare didn't write for scholars. He wrote for the woman selling apples outside the theater, for the drunk leaning against a post, for the lord hiding behind his laughter. He knew that tragedy and comedy weren't opposites. They were neighbors, sharing the same wall. You could weep one minute and laugh the next, because that's what living feels like. And if that sounds familiar, it's because we're still the same creatures, centuries later, trying to make sense of ourselves through stories. The irony, of course, is that the very people who created those masterpieces were often despised. Actors were seen as sinners, liars, even criminals. The church condemned them, the law distrusted them, and yet the people adored them. Maybe that's the oldest contradiction in art. Society always craves what it claims to reject. The Puritans tried to shut the theaters down, calling them breeding grounds for sin, and to be fair, they weren't entirely wrong. There was drinking, gambling, fighting, and the occasional brawl that ended with someone in the Thames. But alongside the chaos, there was revelation, moments that made even the hardest men feel something they couldn't explain. That was the real threat. Not the sin, but the awakening. It's strange to think that while plague ravaged the streets, people still gathered shoulder to shoulder to watch actors pretend to die of heartbreak. The line between fiction and survival blurred. Maybe that's why the plays were so powerful, because they were born from a world constantly on the edge of collapse. The actors understood death intimately. They had seen it, smelled it, survived it. When they performed a death scene, it wasn't melodrama. It was memory. And the audience knew it. They laughed louder because they'd cried harder. They applauded because they needed to believe that art could outlast decay. The city itself seemed to breathe with the rhythm of those performances. Every tavern echoed with arguments about which actor was better. Every marketplace hummed with whispers of the latest scandalous line. People repeated quotes the way we repeat memes, reshaping them, misusing them, making them their own. Even those who had never set foot in a theater spoke its language. It's ironic how a form of art so public, so rooted in the noise of daily life, would later become associated with dusty libraries and academic lectures. The Elizabethans would have laughed at the thought. They didn't analyze Hamlet. They shouted at him. And perhaps that's the lesson hidden beneath all the dirt and poetry, that art belongs to the living, not the preserved. It thrives in noise, in imperfection, in the clash of emotion and intellect. The Elizabethans didn't create beauty by escaping chaos. They created it by diving straight into it. Their theaters were built beside brothels and bear pits. Their actors performed during epidemics and political unrest. And yet, they made something eternal. Maybe that's what makes their legacy so haunting. They remind us that art doesn't need comfort. It needs courage. When you think about it, we're not so different from them. We too live in noisy cities, surrounded by distraction, constantly searching for meaning. We still gather, in theaters and cinemas, on glowing screens, to watch strangers act out our fears and fantasies. The medium has changed, but the ritual hasn't. We still crave that collective heartbeat, that brief suspension of disbelief that tells us life, for all its ugliness, can still be beautiful. The Elizabethans didn't have special effects or surround sound. They had something rarer, each other. And maybe that's why, even now if you listen closely, the echoes remain. Somewhere between the hum of traffic and the hum of memory, you can almost hear the cheers, the laughter, the heartbeat of a world that refused to stop feeling. The wooden theaters are gone, the actors long buried, but their stories still rise like smoke, wild, imperfect, and eternal. Because the truth is, the stage never really vanished. It just moved into us. We're still performing, still pretending, still trying to make sense of our own little tragedies. And as long as we keep listening, the show never ends. It's strange to think that the Elizabethan theater, so vivid, so alive, was born from a world that barely tolerated it. The stage didn't rise from marble or gold, but from mud and defiance. It grew out of the taverns, the streets, the whispers of a restless people who wanted to see themselves reflected, not sermonized. The church frowned, the lawmakers scowled, and yet every time a new play was announced, the crowds came running like moths to a flame. Maybe that's because the flame wasn't just entertainment, it was rebellion disguised as laughter. Picture the scene. A wooden O, open to the sky, sunlight falling on faces of every class, peasants, pickpockets, poets, and nobles. They were all there, pressed together, sweating in the London heat, reeking of ale and humanity. But for a few hours, they were something more than their circumstances. They were participants in an illusion that made life, for once, feel larger than its suffering. And that's the quiet brilliance of those theaters. They didn't just show life, they transformed it. You could enter as a cobbler and leave as a king. And yet, the irony is that outside those walls, life was anything but regal. London was a city perpetually on the verge of decay. Rats in the alleys, filth in the gutters, the smell of smoke and sickness everywhere. The same people who cheered for princes on stage would step out and trudge home through sludge, their boots soaked in a mixture of mud and misery. But maybe that's why they loved the theater so fiercely. It didn't offer escape in the modern sense. It offered reflection. It let them see that even kings bled, even lovers suffered. Even fools sometimes spoke the truth. The stage was a reminder that the world's absurdity had purpose, or at least poetry. The performers themselves were creatures of contradiction. On stage, they were heroes, philosophers, gods. Off stage, they were vagabonds, often paid less than the musicians who played before them. Respect was a luxury. Survival was the job. And yet, they chased the craft with an intensity that bordered on madness. You had to, when a single cough from the crowd could drown out your soliloquy. Every performance was a duel. You versus distraction, silence versus chaos. Imagine projecting Hamlet's grief while a drunk in the pit yells, "He's behind you." That was the beauty of it. Nothing was guaranteed. Every moment demanded presence. And somehow, in that rawness, real art was born. Because art doesn't emerge from comfort, it grows in friction. The actors learned to adapt, to listen, to feel the audience like an invisible current. They could sense when a line landed, when a joke failed, when silence stretched too long. They became emotional acrobats, bending and leaping between moods, tones, and temperaments. It's no wonder that, even centuries later, actors still study their methods. The Elizabethans understood what so many forget. Performance isn't imitation, it's transformation. It's not pretending to be someone else. It's revealing a truth that only fiction can make bearable. The audiences, too, were part of the act. They didn't sit in darkness, politely absorbing meaning. They shouted, jeered, clapped, argued, even flirted mid-monologue. They were as much a part of the play as the actors themselves. Sometimes, a clever actor would pause mid-line to respond to a heckler, and the crowd would erupt in laughter. The performance became a living thing, unpredictable, communal, electric. That's something our modern screens can't quite replicate. The thrill of knowing that what you're witnessing exists only once, in that specific hour, shared by everyone breathing the same air. Once it's gone forever. And then there were the words, the true stars of the age. They weren't just lines to be spoken, they were living entities, pulsing with rhythm and meaning. The playwrights wrote not for quiet readers, but for roaring crowds. Their sentences had to sing, shout, seduce, and sting all at once. Shakespeare could turn a phrase about love into a knife, or make an insult sound like a prayer. His language was reckless and tender, vulgar and divine, a reflection of life itself. And maybe that's why it still works, because deep down we recognize ourselves in the contradictions. We too are noble and ridiculous, brave and cowardly, full of longing and full of fear. What's almost comic, though, is how little they knew of their own immortality. They were writing for next week's crowd, not the next century. Their scripts were tools, not relics. If a play failed, they moved on. If it succeeded, it was copied by hand and sold in taverns. No one imagined that their words would one day be analyzed under fluorescent lights by generations who'd never smelled the Thames or heard the roar of a crowd under open sky. And maybe that's what gives their work its soul. It wasn't trying to be eternal. It was just trying to be honest. Honesty, after all, was their rebellion. The theater didn't preach morality. It exposed hypocrisy. It showed the audience themselves, greedy, flawed, yearning, absurd, and dared them to laugh about it. That's what made it dangerous. Governments can handle violence, but not laughter. You can silence a protest, but you can't censor irony once it's in the bloodstream. Every joke, every clever line that poked fun at power, carried the spark of subversion. And maybe that's why the Puritans eventually shut the theaters down. Not because they were sinful, but because they were too alive. But life, as history keeps proving, doesn't stay silent for long. Even when the stages were destroyed, the words survived. People recited them in secret, performed them in barns, whispered them in taverns. The world can ban theaters, but it can't ban the human need to tell stories. It's an instinct as old as breath, to make sense of chaos by shaping it into narrative. That's what the Elizabethans were doing, and what we still do today, whether through films, songs, or a thread of text scrolling on a glowing screen at 2 a.m. Maybe that's the real legacy of their world. The courage to look at the dirt and find poetry in it. To understand that beauty isn't the absence of ugliness, but its companion. They taught us that tragedy can be funny, that laughter can be sacred, that art doesn't need perfection to move the soul. The wooden theaters have long since turned to dust, but their heartbeat hasn't stopped. It echoes in every place where people gather to watch, to listen, to feel. And perhaps that's the quiet miracle of it all, that from filth came glory, from laughter came truth, and from the chaos of a plague-ridden city came the most enduring art the world has ever known. If you close your eyes long enough, you can almost hear it. The shuffle of feet on wooden boards, the rustle of a crowd leaning forward. The first line spoken into the open air. The words rise, the audience breathes, and for one impossible moment, the world stands still. Then, as always, the applause comes, and the spell begins again. There's something hauntingly human about the way the Elizabethans built their theaters, open to the sky, vulnerable to rain, and yet determined to stand. The architecture itself was a metaphor, fragile yet fearless. The globe and its rivals weren't monuments, they were living organisms. They breathed the same air as the audience, shared their laughter, and soaked up their sweat. You could say the buildings had souls, carved from timber, warmed by breath, echoing with the sound of 1,000 heartbeats beating in unison. The actors didn't perform to the crowd, they performed with it. The separation between art and life was as thin as the planks beneath their feet. What made it so miraculous wasn't just the plays, it was the collision of opposites that happened every afternoon. Aristocrats in velvet cloaks stood beside sailors who hadn't bathed in weeks. Poets debated peasants. Pickpockets brushed against bishops. For the price of a loaf of bread, the lowest man in London could stand within spitting distance of the Queen's favorite courtiers. And sometimes, quite literally, there was spitting. The audience wasn't passive. It was alive, merciless, and gloriously unrestrained. If they liked a line, they roared with laughter. If they didn't, they made sure everyone knew. It wasn't theater as we imagine it today, all polite applause and whispered praise. It was a brawl of emotion, half holy ritual, half street fight. That rawness gave birth to something powerful, authenticity. The plays weren't polished diamonds. They were uncut stones, jagged and dazzling. There was no time to overthink or over-edit. Scripts were written fast, rehearsed faster, and performed before the ink had dried. But in that chaos, genius thrived. Words spilled onto the stage like lightning, unpredictable, luminous, impossible to contain. And isn't that, in a way, what creativity really is? The refusal to wait for perfection before speaking. The Elizabethans understood that art, like life, is better when it's slightly unhinged. The performers were the lifeblood of that madness. They lived in constant motion. Actors by day, hustlers by night, sometimes fugitives by morning. They weren't just artists. They were survivors. To be an actor in that era meant to live with one foot in glory and the other in the gutter. Fame could vanish faster than a candle flame in the wind. Yet there was something almost holy in their pursuit. The belief that standing on a creaking stage with nothing but your voice could alter the world, even if only for an hour. They carried the weight of a nation's imagination on their shoulders, and somehow they made it look effortless. You have to imagine what it must have felt like, performing Othello to an audience that had never seen a story about jealousy so raw, or Macbeth to people who believed witches were very real. The theater wasn't abstract to them, it was dangerous. Words could start riots. A single joke about the wrong noble could land you in prison. Every performance was a high-wire act. One slip, and the law or the church would come crashing down. Yet the actors kept going, grinning through fear, driven by the same strange fire that's kept every artist burning since time began, the need to be heard. The playwrights, of course, were their own breed of lunatic genius. They worked like machines, writing for bread, for recognition, or simply to outrun starvation. Christopher Marlowe's plays dripped with ambition and blasphemy, the kind of brilliance that made even his friends nervous. Ben Jonson wrote with the ego of a man who thought God himself was his editor. Shakespeare, meanwhile, wrote with something quieter, not arrogance, but awe. He didn't write about people, he wrote as them. Kings, beggars, lovers, fools. He wore their voices like masks, slipping between them with impossible grace. It's almost comedic to imagine him at his desk, quill in hand, crafting lines that would outlive empires while worrying about whether the tavern still had credit for his dinner. But what made their work extraordinary wasn't the poetry. It was the understanding of people. They knew that humanity doesn't change much, but we still crave the same things: love, revenge, belonging, significance. We still laugh at the same absurdities, grieve over the same losses, and pretend we're more rational than we actually are. The Elizabethans didn't separate the profound from the profane because they knew both lived under the same skin. A joke about a drunkard could stand beside a speech about mortality, and somehow it all made sense, because that's what life feels like. Tragedy with bad timing. The crowds came because they recognized themselves. The plays weren't mirrors held up to perfection, but to the glorious mess of reality. People saw their greed, their guilt, their vanity exposed under the daylight, and they laughed, not because it wasn't true, but because it was. That laughter, sharp, unfiltered, contagious, was more than amusement. It was survival. In a world of disease and despair, laughter was the only medicine anyone could afford. It's a miracle, really, that something as fragile as a joke could hold a civilization together. And perhaps the greatest irony of all was that the theater, condemned by the powerful as sinful and foolish, ended up being the very thing that defined their culture. Those wooden stages, once dismissed as playgrounds for scoundrels, became the birthplace of a national identity. The English language itself grew inside them, expanding with every monologue, every drunken pun. What began as entertainment evolved into legacy. The laughter of the groundlings turned into the vocabulary of kings. The words they shouted to drown out boredom became the foundation of a literature that would outlast every throne. If you think about it, maybe that's the secret of all great art. It begins in the dirt, not the palace. The Elizabethans didn't aim to be remembered. They aimed to be understood. They weren't trying to be immortal. They were trying to stay human. And somehow, that honesty made them immortal anyway. There's a certain comfort in that. A reminder that beauty doesn't need permission to exist. It only needs an audience brave enough to listen. And even now, centuries later, that same spirit lingers. The world has traded wooden theaters for glowing screens, live voices for pixels, but the need is the same. We still gather to watch stories about ourselves, still laugh at our failures, still search for meaning in chaos. Somewhere deep down, the Elizabethan flame hasn't gone out. It's just flickered into a new shape. You can hear it in every gasp during a film, every cheer at a concert, every silence that falls before the final line. The stage has changed, but the story never has. Maybe that's the truest thing the Elizabethans ever taught us, that no matter how much the world evolves, people don't. We're still the same glorious contradiction of brilliance and stupidity, cruelty and tenderness, vanity and hope. And maybe that's why, even now, when we read their words or imagine their world, it feels strangely familiar. Because in their laughter, their longing, and their chaos, we recognize the most honest version of ourselves, the version still trying after all this time to make sense of being alive. There's a strange kind of immortality that comes from things never meant to last. The Elizabethan playhouses weren't temples of art. They were wooden shells, half mud and half miracle, built on borrowed land and borrowed time. Yet somehow, against fire, plague, and the fury of preachers, they refused to die. They stood like stubborn laughter in the face of doom, proof that humans will always choose stories over silence. You can almost imagine the builders hammering those planks together, unaware that they were constructing not just a theater, but an idea, one so loud it would echo for centuries. Maybe that's the most beautiful irony of all. They built something temporary that became eternal. The walls rotted, the roofs collapsed, the names of most of the actors vanished, but the words stayed. Words written to please drunkards and dreamers alike somehow outlived kings and conquerors. It's almost comical, isn't it? The same society that feared laughter built the foundation of its legacy on it. The same city that stank of rot and sewage gave birth to the most elegant expressions of love and death ever written. It's proof that beauty doesn't bloom in peace, it blooms in chaos. And chaos was everywhere. London wasn't some romantic postcard of cobblestones and candlelight. It was alive, filthy, and unrepentant. People shouted from every corner, selling fish, flowers, and miracles. The streets were full of smells, roasted meat, unwashed bodies, and the faint sweetness of decay. Yet amid that sensory assault, the theater offered a different kind of intoxication. It wasn't about escaping reality, it was about transforming it. Inside those open-air playhouses, the poorest man could feel like a philosopher, and the richest could feel like a fool. For a few shillings, you could buy the illusion of meaning. And sometimes that illusion felt truer than truth itself. The actors knew this instinctively. They weren't saints or scholars. They were improvisers of emotion. They understood the rhythm of a crowd better than any politician. They knew when to pause, when to tease, when to strike. Their art wasn't learned. It was felt. A bad performance could end in mockery, but a great one could change the air itself. Imagine standing in front of hundreds of strangers, all eyes on you, knowing that if you falter, they'll devour you. But if you soar, they'll follow you anywhere. That's theater. It's not about safety, it's about surrender. And surrender they did, both audience and actor, meeting somewhere between reality and illusion. The plays themselves were mirrors, but not the polished kind you find in palaces. They were cracked, smudged, and brutally honest. They reflected not who people wanted to be, but who they really were. A thief could see his cunning praised in a villain's wit. A noble could hear his vanity mocked in a jester's joke. Even the queen herself, if she listened closely, could catch her own reflection hidden in a line about tyranny. The theater made everyone equal, not by erasing their differences, but by exposing their humanity. It's almost funny to think that these plays, performed by men in wigs, pretending to be women, pretending to be angels or witches, revealed more truth than most sermons ever could. The Elizabethans didn't go to church for salvation. They went to the theater for recognition. To laugh at the absurdity of life was its own kind of faith. It said, yes, the world is cruel, but at least we can understand it for a while. Maybe that's why even the devout couldn't stay away. You can condemn sin from the pulpit all you want, but deep down, everyone loves a good story about temptation. And oh, how they loved excess. If there's one thing the Elizabethans understood, it's that subtlety is overrated. They loved spectacle. Sword fights, ghosts, thunder made from rolling cannonballs backstage. The stage was a playground for the senses, a place where the impossible became briefly possible. People gasped when witches vanished in smoke, or when blood spilled on stage so convincingly they swore someone had truly died. And maybe that's the secret to their magic. They didn't try to hide the illusion. They let the audience see the trick and still believe it. There's something profoundly human in that paradox, wanting to be fooled, but needing to know it's a lie. But the real magic wasn't in the props or the pageantry. It was in the language. Those words, dense and musical, weren't meant to be read quietly. They were meant to crash against eardrums, to taste alive in the mouth. Elizabethan playwrights wrote as if the English language were a living beast they were trying to tame, and sometimes it bit back. They invented words when existing ones failed, turned verbs into nouns, nouns into weapons, and insults into poetry. If they couldn't find the right sound, they made it up. You can almost see Shakespeare grinning as he coins eyeball or bedazzled, probably unaware that schoolchildren centuries later would curse his creativity during exams. And through it all, humor stitched everything together. Even in their darkest tragedies, the Elizabethans couldn't resist slipping in a joke, not out of disrespect, but out of understanding. Laughter, after all, was the only thing strong enough to hold despair in check. They didn't separate the sacred from the profane because they knew both belonged to the same human heart. Life was tragic, but it was also absurd. The only sensible response was to play along. Perhaps that's why, in moments of disaster, people still turn to comedy, not to escape pain, but to tame it. There's a peculiar wisdom in that, one the modern world could learn from. We've become so obsessed with polish, with perfect lighting, perfect performances, perfect lives, that we've forgotten how to love the flaws. The Elizabethans didn't hide their mess. They celebrated it. Their stages leaked rain, their actors stumbled over lines, their scripts were written in haste, and yet somehow it worked. Maybe because it wasn't about the perfection of the show, but the imperfection of the soul. They weren't performing for us. They were performing as us, confused, loud, brilliant, and broken. And that's why, centuries later, their echoes still linger. You can rebuild the globe in perfect replica, fill it with modern lights and tourists with cameras, but the real ghost of that era isn't in the wood or the words, it's in the energy. The stubborn belief that stories matter, that laughter can heal, that art, no matter how fragile, can outlive its makers. If you stand there long enough, under the same open sky, you might even hear it, the distant murmur of a crowd, the heartbeat of a world that refused to give up on wonder. It's a comforting thought that long after the applause has faded, after the actors have vanished and the city has changed beyond recognition, the essence remains. Because maybe that's the true legacy of the Elizabethans. Not their plays, not their poetry, but their faith in the performance of living. They understood that life itself is a kind of theater, unpredictable, ridiculous, and heartbreakingly brief. And like all great performances, it deserves our full attention. There's something magnetic about the idea that a few planks of wood and some half-mad actors once held an entire city under their spell. The Elizabethan theater didn't just entertain, it possessed people. For a few hours, the cobbler forgot the blisters on his hands, the fishmonger forgot the stench of the docks, and the nobleman forgot the weight of his reputation. They all stood together, laughing, gasping, sweating beneath the same sun, bound by the same story. That's the real alchemy of art. It turned strangers into a single pulse. And it did so, not by promising escape, but by offering recognition. They didn't run away from life inside those theaters. They walked straight into it. The plays were never gentle mirrors. They were warped, cracked, and gloriously unforgiving. The audience didn't see idealized versions of themselves. They saw their flaws, their greed, their pettiness, reflected so clearly that they had no choice but to laugh. Imagine sitting there and watching a drunken fool brag about wisdom, only to realize halfway through that the fool sounds suspiciously like you after a few pints. That was the brilliance of it. Laughter, not as mockery, but as confession. The theater held up the human soul like a jewel under harsh sunlight, and instead of polishing it, it showed every scratch and imperfection. What made this even more fascinating was that it all unfolded in a world teetering on the edge of collapse. The Elizabethans didn't live in comfort. They lived in crisis. Disease stalked the streets. Monarchs rose and fell, and the line between faith and fear blurred daily. Yet somehow, in the midst of that chaos, people craved more chaos. On stage, they didn't want calm, they wanted catharsis. Watching a tragedy unfold was a way of saying, at least someone else's life is worse than mine. It's the same reason we watch reality TV today, except with better language and fewer confessionals. And oh, how the language danced. The playwrights treated words like living creatures, untamed, mischievous, unpredictable. English was still young, still stretching its limbs, and the theater was its playground. They invented phrases, twisted grammar, and stuffed sentences with rhythm and music. A single monologue could sound like a song, a prayer, and a curse all at once. When you hear those lines now, centuries later, they still hum with energy, as if they remember the mouths that first spoke them. The funny thing is, half the audience back then probably didn't understand every word, but they felt it. Because emotion doesn't need translation. You can't intellectualize goosebumps. What's striking is how those words survived the noise of the world around them. London was a city of contradictions. Grandeur beside poverty, faith beside filth. Theaters were built next to taverns and brothels, their walls vibrating with music, laughter, and the occasional fight. The audience didn't come dressed for contemplation. They came ready to live loudly. And yet, amid all that chaos, silence could still fall when a line struck too deep. Imagine thousands of rowdy voices suddenly going quiet, as if the world itself had paused to listen. That's power. Not the kind that crowns rulers, but the kind that makes them human. The actors understood that power intimately. They weren't celebrities in the modern sense. No cameras, no glamour, no privacy. They were craftsmen, shaping emotion with their bodies, their voices, their vulnerability. Some nights they performed for thunderous applause, other nights for jeers and rotten apples. But that risk made every show alive. They knew that art is never safe, and that's exactly why it matters. It's ironic. We live in an age obsessed with safety, with control, with erasing every imperfection. But the Elizabethans knew better. They knew that to be human is to risk humiliation for the chance at meaning. That risk extended to the playwrights, too. They were more than artists. They were political acrobats, dodging censorship with wit sharper than any blade. You couldn't insult a noble directly, but you could create a character suspiciously similar to him and let the audience connect the dots. It was satire as survival. The authorities thought they controlled the narrative, but the stage always found a loophole. Humor became rebellion and tragedy became prophecy. It's almost poetic that the government feared laughter more than sedition, because laughter can't be legislated. Once an idea makes people laugh, it becomes unstoppable. And maybe that's why even now their words feel dangerous, not because of what they say, but because of what they reveal. When you strip away the centuries, the costumes, the Old English, what's left is painfully familiar. Jealousy, ambition, desire, guilt, hope. The same emotions that drove them still drive us. The only difference is the setting. They wore ruffs and carried daggers. We wear earbuds and carry smartphones. But the script hasn't changed, only the stage directions. Maybe that's the quiet joke history keeps telling us. Every generation thinks it's new, but really, we're just performing the same lines with better lighting. It's tempting to look back and think the Elizabethans were rough or primitive, but in many ways, they were freer than we are. They didn't have filters, literal or metaphorical. They didn't curate their lives for an audience. They were the audience. Their laughter wasn't ironic. It was raw, sometimes cruel, but always honest. They didn't laugh to signal intelligence. They laughed because something in the chaos of words reminded them that life, despite everything, was still worth living. And maybe that's what the theater was for, to remind people who were constantly surrounded by death that joy was still possible, even if it came wrapped in absurdity. The best part is, none of it was planned. The playwrights weren't thinking about posterity or legacy. They weren't crafting masterpieces for the ages. They were hustling to meet deadlines, dodging debt collectors, and trying to fill seats. And somehow, in that desperation, they stumbled upon immortality. It's a comforting thought, really. That greatness doesn't require perfection, only persistence. Maybe that's why those old words still breathe. They were never written for eternity, only for the next afternoon. Eternity just happened to show up. And if you stand in that space today, the rebuilt globe, sunlight pouring onto the stage, tourists whispering in awe, you can feel it. Not nostalgia, but continuity. The same hum of anticipation, the same flicker of wonder, the same heartbeat that's been repeating for 400 years. The actors still speak those same lines into the same open air, and the audience still laughs at the same jokes, gasps at the same betrayals, weeps at the same deaths. That's not history, that's proof. Proof that the human story never really ends. It just keeps changing costumes. It's funny how the Elizabethan age is often remembered for its elegance, the lace collars, the poetry, the golden glow of Merry England. But if you could walk through those streets, you'd find something far less polished and far more alive. London wasn't a city of grace, it was a city of grit. Horses clattered through mud thick enough to swallow a boot. Merchants shouted over one another like rival actors, and the air was heavy with smoke and gossip. Yet, amid the stench and the noise, something extraordinary pulsed. An explosion of imagination so vast it couldn't be contained by cathedrals or palaces. It spilled into the streets, and from there onto the stage. The theater was the heartbeat of that restless city. It was where all classes collided, not politely, but gloriously. Aristocrats leaned over balconies, while beggars heckled from the pit. It was one of the few places in the world where power and poverty breathed the same air. And perhaps that was part of its magic. For a few hours, no one was untouchable, not even the Queen. You could be mocked, exposed, or redeemed, all under the guise of entertainment. It was dangerous democracy wrapped in rhythm and rhyme. The church preached salvation through faith. The theater preached it through laughter. And the people, weary of sermons, chose laughter every time. There's a delicious irony in the fact that the most lasting art of the age came from people who were barely respected. Actors were considered vagabonds, writers were viewed as troublemakers, and the theaters themselves were treated as dens of vice. The authorities tried to shut them down. The Puritans called them houses of sin. But the more the moralists protested, the fuller the audiences became. It's almost as if rebellion has always been the best marketing strategy. People don't flock to what's pure, they flock to what's forbidden. And so, while the pious were busy condemning, the rest of London was busy laughing. The laughter wasn't gentle either. It was loud, unrestrained, often vulgar. These weren't people sipping wine and politely clapping. They were howling, jeering, throwing fruit, living every moment as if the play were an extension of their own chaotic lives. They didn't want perfection. They wanted truth. Messy, ridiculous truth. They wanted to see kings humiliated, fools exalted, and villains punished in ways that made poetic sense, even when real life didn't. And maybe that's why the theater felt sacred, even to those who called it profane. It gave justice to a world that refused to offer it. The actors understood this better than anyone. They were part magicians, part psychologists. With no microphones, no special effects, just their voices and bodies, they conjured entire worlds. The audience believed because the actors believed. Not in the story, but in the moment. There's a lesson in that even now. Conviction sells more than truth ever will. People don't follow facts, they follow feeling. Every actor who stepped on stage in those days knew that to survive, you couldn't merely speak the words, you had to bleed them. Every gesture mattered, every glance carried meaning. It wasn't performance, it was possession. And the words they spoke, my God, the words. The Elizabethans treated language like clay, stretching and shaping it into forms that had never existed before. English itself was still young, still wild, and they tamed it by refusing to tame it. They created words because they could, stitched metaphors out of chaos, and made even the vulgar sound poetic. When Shakespeare wrote about love or betrayal, he wasn't describing feelings. He was inventing the language that would define them. Imagine living in a time when the dictionary was still being written and you could just decide what reality sounded like. There's freedom in that kind of uncertainty, the kind that makes creativity feel dangerous and divine at the same time. Yet, for all their brilliance, the playwrights were hustlers. They wrote fast, borrowed shamelessly, and stole ideas from whoever didn't guard them well enough. Inspiration wasn't sacred, it was survival. If one play flopped, another had to be ready by next week. You couldn't afford writer's block when rent was due, and the plague might shut down your theater at any moment. And somehow, that pressure forged diamonds. Maybe that's why the plays still resonate. They were written with urgency, with the desperate pulse of life itself. They weren't crafted to last forever. They were crafted to matter now. And maybe that's why they lasted forever anyway. The irony is that these plays, born in noise and filth, would one day be performed in pristine theaters for quiet audiences in expensive clothes. But if you listen closely during even the most refined production, you can still hear the ghosts of that original chaos, the roar of laughter, the hiss of disapproval, the heartbeat of a crowd that knew how to feel. The words may have aged, but the emotions haven't, because humanity hasn't changed all that much. We still crave stories that make us confront our own contradictions, the beauty and the ugliness, the comedy and the tragedy. The Elizabethans simply had the courage to put it all on display. And perhaps what makes their world so endlessly fascinating is that it didn't try to hide its mess. Everything, the art, the politics, the morality, existed in a constant state of tension. The same city that produced Shakespeare also produced witch trials. The same people who wept at Romeo and Juliet would watch an execution the next morning without flinching. They lived at full volume, feeling, fearing, desiring without the filters we've since invented. Maybe that's why their art still shocks us. It's not that it was ahead of its time, it's that we've fallen behind it. We've learned to be polite where they dared to be alive. What's truly miraculous, though, is how much of their chaos turned into order, how a world so transient created something timeless. The words that once echoed through open-air theaters now echo through time itself. They survive every translation, every adaptation, every classroom that tries to tame them. And that's because they weren't written for scholars. They were written for people, flawed, hungry, hopeful people who wanted to see themselves on stage. They didn't seek perfection. They sought connection. And that's why even now, when someone says to be or not to be, we still understand exactly what they mean, even if we've never read the play. It's not about Hamlet, it's about us. Maybe that's the secret thread running through all of it. The reason the Elizabethan theater refuses to fade. It wasn't a monument to greatness. It was a celebration of humanity, of the contradictions, the laughter, the filth, the genius, the unspoken truth, that we're all just improvising our way through the story. When you think about it, maybe that's what every age of art is trying to do. Not to perfect life, but to perform it. And if that performance still makes us stop, laugh, cry, or simply remember that we're alive, then the curtain, even after 400 years, has never really fallen. It's almost poetic that something as fragile as a wooden stage became the most enduring monument of its age. No marble, no bronze, no cathedrals carved in stone could rival it. The Elizabethan theater was the heartbeat of a world that didn't know how to sit still, a world too alive to be tidy. It wasn't built for eternity, it was built for today. Yet somehow that hunger for the present became its immortality. Because in those few hours between the raising and the falling of the curtain, people found something the rest of life rarely gave them. Truth disguised as play. The truth was rarely flattering. The theater of that time wasn't afraid of ugliness. It embraced it, dressed it up, and danced with it. The plays didn't just tell stories, they wrestled with the chaos of existence. They made beauty out of disease, laughter out of despair, and philosophy out of nonsense. Imagine sitting in a crowd where one moment you're weeping over a lover's death, and the next, you're laughing at a drunkard slipping in mud. That wasn't tonal confusion, it was honesty. Life didn't separate comedy from tragedy, so neither did they. Maybe that's why modern audiences still find those plays so addictive. They feel truer than truth itself. The audience was as much a character as the actors. They were loud, opinionated, unfiltered. They heckled, they sang, they fainted, they flirted, they fought. If the play didn't move them, they moved the play, literally. It was democracy before democracy knew what it was. The groundlings down front, standing for a penny, were the soul of the performance. They didn't come for polite appreciation. They came for blood, laughter, and spectacle. They wanted to feel something, anything to shake off the monotony of their grim daily lives. And they got their money's worth. The actors might have feared their fury, but they also fed on it. That energy, that unpredictability, that was the real magic. Behind the curtain, the chaos was even more thrilling. Imagine cramped dressing rooms filled with actors shouting lines, smearing paint and sewing costumes moments before they went on. No stage lights, no microphones, just candle flames and raw adrenaline. Every performance was a gamble. The weather might change mid-scene, a drunk might wander on stage, or a rival company might steal your script by bribing a boy actor, but the risk was part of the art. The fragility made it precious. It's almost funny how much perfection we demand from performance today. Flawless lighting, flawless timing, flawless emotion, as if flaws weren't the very thing that makes something worth watching. The actors themselves were contradictions made flesh, outcasts one moment, celebrities the next. Some were adored, others despised, but all were necessary. They carried not just lines, but worlds in their lungs. Their voices had to reach the back of the pit and still make the words sound human. And they didn't just play characters, they became them. It's hard not to wonder what it does to a person to live as someone else so often. Maybe that's why many of them blurred the line between role and reality. The audience might have gone home after the show, but for the actors, the performance never really ended. And of course, the words they spoke were alive. Not dead artifacts, not museum pieces, but living, breathing creatures. The English language itself was still molten, still forming. Shakespeare and his contemporaries stretched it in ways no one had dared before. They mixed street slang with royal rhetoric, dirty jokes with divine poetry. Their sentences didn't just describe the world, they built it. The language was wild, and they didn't try to tame it. Maybe that's the secret of why those words still work. They were written when English still remembered how to misbehave. It's easy to romanticize all this, to imagine the globe bathed in sunlight and brilliance, but it was also a place of darkness, literal and moral. The plague was always waiting just beyond the laughter. The same crowd that applauded a tragedy might be mourning friends by nightfall. Death wasn't an abstract fear, it was a daily visitor. And maybe that's why the plays hit so hard. When you live in constant uncertainty, art stops being decoration. It becomes necessity. The theater gave them a way to stare into the abyss and laugh, to give shape to the chaos before it swallowed them. In a way, that's all storytelling has ever been. Organized survival. The city itself seemed complicit in the performance. The Thames carried the echo of applause down its waters. Tavern owners made fortunes off post-play revelry, and pickpockets worked the crowds like artists. Every alley was a stage, every argument a monologue. London wasn't just a backdrop, it was an accomplice. And the funny thing is, the theater reflected that energy right back at it. Plays about murder and monarchy, about lust and lies, all mirrored the city's contradictions. It's as if London and its theater were in a long, passionate argument, loud, messy, and utterly inseparable. But even in that frenzy, there were moments of silence. Moments when a line would fall into the air and hang there, heavy and unmovable. When a speech about love or death stopped the laughter cold. Those moments were rare and fragile, but they reminded everyone, the rich, the poor, the thief, the noble, that they were all equally mortal. That's what the theater did best. It leveled the playing field of existence. It reminded everyone that no matter how different their lives were, they were all hurt by the same things and healed by the same stories. And perhaps that's why the legacy of that age refuses to die. Those plays weren't written to be timeless. They were written to be alive. But life has a way of clinging to things that feel real. Centuries later, we still quote their words without realizing it, still steal their rhythms, still chase their truths. The wooden theaters are gone, the actors dust, the audience is long vanished, but the heartbeat remains. It lives in every story told aloud, every performance that dares to be imperfect, every laugh that comes from somewhere deep and unguarded. Because that's what the Elizabethans really left us, not just a canon of plays, but a way of seeing the world. They taught us that art doesn't have to be solemn to be sacred, that laughter can carry more truth than sermons, and that the human condition is far too ridiculous to be taken too seriously. They didn't pretend to understand life, they performed it, one chaotic act at a time. And maybe that's the most honest thing we can do, to step on our own uncertain stages, under our own unpredictable skies, and play our parts with the same reckless grace. Because as they understood better than anyone, the show doesn't wait for perfection. The show just goes on. There's a strange comfort in realizing that the Elizabethans, for all their filth and folly, were never really that different from us. They wanted to be entertained, to feel alive, to laugh at their own misery and call it art. They wanted to belong to something larger than themselves, a story, a moment, a crowd. And that's what the theater gave them, a brief, chaotic version of eternity. The plays didn't promise salvation, they promised recognition. You saw your neighbor in the fool, your boss in the tyrant, your mother-in-law in the witch. Sometimes you even saw yourself, and that was the most frightening part. There's this romantic idea that people of the past were simpler, but nothing could be further from the truth. The Elizabethans were experts at contradiction. They prayed in the morning and sinned by noon. They quoted the Bible and cursed in the same breath. They believed in both divine order and sheer luck. The theater thrived in that contradiction. It was the mirror that didn't lie, and maybe that's why it made people uncomfortable. It's easy to worship an idea of virtue. It's harder to confront your reflection when it's drunk, dirty, and laughing. The irony is that while the church tried to save souls, the theater reminded people they already had them. Every time an actor stepped into the light, it was an act of defiance. Remember, these weren't scholars or saints. They were often runaways, misfits, or debtors. They had nothing to lose but their own dignity. And even that was negotiable. They risked their reputations, their lives, and sometimes their sanity just to make strangers feel something. You could call that foolish, but isn't that what courage really looks like? Doing something absurdly human in a world that rewards masks? The stage was their rebellion against invisibility, and every performance was proof that they existed, if only for an hour. The world off stage, however, wasn't nearly as forgiving. The same society that adored the plays treated the people who made them as disposable. Actors were banned from performing during plagues, accused of spreading disease, and chased from cities like pests. Yet they kept coming back, rebuilding the stages that burned down, rewriting the lines that were censored, and daring to make people laugh while the world crumbled around them. That's resilience in its purest form. Not the glamorous kind with motivational speeches, but the sweaty, hungry kind that just refuses to stop breathing. And then there were the words themselves, the true survivors. Words that carried jokes sharp enough to cut a king and tenderness soft enough to make a beggar cry. Words that could turn lust into poetry and death into philosophy. The brilliance of the Elizabethan playwrights wasn't that they wrote about life, it's that they understood it. They knew that every tragedy hides a punchline and every comedy ends with a hint of melancholy. They didn't write to teach morals, they wrote to tell the truth. The kind of truth that stings first and heals later. You can almost imagine Shakespeare or Marlowe, ink-stained and exhausted, hunched over a candle trying to beat a deadline while rats scurry underfoot. They weren't writing for eternity, they were writing for the next performance, the next paycheck, the next applause. And yet, those desperate words outlived their authors, their cities, even their civilizations. There's something darkly funny about that men so mortal created something that refuses to die. It's as if language itself decided to outlive its makers, whispering, "You thought you were writing about others, but you were writing about yourselves all along." But what's most fascinating is how the theater acted as a time capsule of emotion. Those wooden stages captured everything: rage, lust, grief, greed, like a museum of the human condition. And centuries later, when we perform those same lines, we awaken ghosts. Every actor who takes the stage becomes a kind of a vessel, carrying not just their character, but every performer who came before. There's a humility in that, and maybe a little madness too, to dedicate your life to pretending only to reveal something real. But that's art, isn't it? A beautiful lie that tells the truth better than honesty ever could. And while it's easy to think of that world as ancient, echoes of it live in every crowded cinema, every open mic, every viral video. The same need that drove a London fishmonger to stand for hours in the mud to see Hamlet is the same need that drives someone today to binge watch a series at 3 a.m. We're still seeking that same electric connection. The moment when fiction makes reality blink, we still crave the comfort of seeing our flaws dressed up as stories. Maybe that's the real inheritance of the Elizabethan age. The understanding that performance isn't escape, it's revelation. The laughter that once rattled the rafters of the globe didn't vanish when the plague shut it down or when Puritans destroyed it. It just changed form. It lives now in classrooms and theaters and quiet readers whispering lines under their breath. It exists every time someone uses a phrase that was once brand new in 1601. The Elizabethans didn't just give us plays, they gave us language itself, the raw material of our inner lives. Every heartbreak, every wild goose chase, every foregone conclusion, all gifts from a time when words were experiments, not rules. That's how art survives, by sneaking into our everyday speech until we can't tell where history ends and habit begins. And maybe, in a way, that's the most haunting part of all. The people who lived and died in that dirty, dazzling world didn't think they were making history. They thought they were just trying to make rent, or make someone laugh, or make a moment matter. But that's how all lasting things begin. Not with grand intentions, but with the stubborn refusal to be ordinary. The Elizabethans didn't aim for eternity, they stumbled into it. And perhaps that's the lesson they leave us. Stop trying to make something perfect and start making something alive. Because when the curtain finally fell each night, when the torches were doused and the mud thickened underfoot, the audience walked away carrying something invisible, the strange awareness that they had just witnessed themselves. The fool, the king, the ghost, the lover, all reflections of the same restless creature called human. Maybe that's why we still go to the theater, still crave stories, still laugh in the dark with strangers. We're not escaping life. We're meeting it halfway, hoping that for a few brief moments we might understand what it means to be alive. And if that isn't the greatest act ever performed, then perhaps the Elizabethans knew something we've forgotten. That even when the stage rots and the actors die, the play, somehow, always finds a way to begin again,